The silence was her constant companion, but it had never felt as crushing as it did now. Rebecca Collins stood at the edge of Clearwater Valley, her thin shawl offering little protection against the biting wind that swept across the open plains. Her fingers, cracked and bleeding from weeks of failed attempts at survival, trembled as she watched the last of the settler wagons disappear over the horizon. They had left her behind, abandoned her to the merciless wilderness with nothing but the clothes on her back and the deafening silence that had defined her life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Let the savage land claim the savage woman. William Thornton had sneered, his lips exaggerating each word so she could read them clearly. God has already marked you as unfit. Rebecca touched her ear instinctively, a habit formed over 28 years of living in a world where sound existed only in her imagination. She had been born this way, emerging into a world of silence that her parents had never fully understood. But it was here, on the frontier, where her deafness had finally become her undoing. Rebecca had arrived in Clearwater Valley 6 months earlier, alongside her husband Daniel. He had been her voice, her shield against a world that viewed her difference as a defect. Daniel Collins had learned to speak with his hands, creating a bridge between Rebecca's silent world and the cacophony that surrounded them. Together, they had dreamed of carving out a life on the frontier, away from the pitying glances and whispered judgments of the city. But the frontier was unforgiving. 3 months after establishing their small homestead, Daniel fell from the roof while making repairs before the winter. The injury festered, and within days he was gone, taking with him Rebecca's connection to the world of the hearing. For weeks she had managed. Her parents, despite their inability to fully understand her silence, had taught her to be self-sufficient. She could hunt small game, tend to the vegetable garden Daniel had started, and keep herself alive through sheer force of will. But as summer gave way to autumn, and the first early frosts killed her struggling crops, desperation set in. It was then that Rebecca ventured into the settlement, seeking help the only way she knew how, through written notes and gestures. The reception she received chilled her more deeply than the approaching winter ever could. "We don't have resources for normal folk, let alone." Martha Thornton had waved her hand dismissively at Rebecca's notepad, her lip curled in disgust. Edward Miller, who owned the general store, had laughed openly when Rebecca tried to trade a poorly tanned rabbit skin for flour. What use is a deaf woman to anyone? Can't even hear danger coming, probably get us all killed by Indians. Only Joseph Weber, the blacksmith, and his wife Clara had shown her any kindness, offering her a small sack of cornmeal and a sympathetic glance. But their charity wasn't enough to silence the growing chorus calling for her removal. "She's a burden," William Thornton had declared at the town meeting. Rebecca couldn't hear his words, but she could read the hatred on his face as he pointed at her. "Winter's coming, and we barely have enough to feed our own. Besides, her kind brings bad luck." Her kind, as if deafness made her something other than human. That night, they had come to her cabin, William Thornton, Edward Miller, and 3 other men. They had dragged her out into the cold, thrown her meager possessions into a heap, and set fire to the small home she and Daniel had built together. Through the flames, she watched William's mouth form the words that sealed her fate. "Head north. Or south, east or west. Just get gone. You're not our responsibility." And so she had walked directionless for 3 days. Without Daniel to help her navigate, each rustle of leaves, each shadow stretching across her path became a potential threat she couldn't hear approaching. Hunger clawed at her stomach. Thirst made her tongue stick to the roof of her mouth. Cold seeped into her bones, a constant reminder of her mortality. On the 4th day, as the sun began to sink below the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and purple. Rebecca collapsed. Her legs, trembling from exhaustion and malnutrition, simply gave out beneath her. She curled into herself at the base of a large pine, pulling her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders as the temperature dropped. This was how it would end, she thought. Not with the family she and Daniel had dreamed of, not with the dignity of old age, but alone in the wilderness, abandoned by those who found her silence too burdensome to bear. As darkness descended, Rebecca closed her eyes, too exhausted to fear what might find her in the night. The world had already taken everything from her. There was nothing left to lose. Just before consciousness slipped away, a shadow fell across her face. Rebecca's eyes snapped open to find a figure standing over her, tall and imposing against the darkening sky. She couldn't make out the features, but the silhouette was unmistakably human. With the last of her strength, she pushed herself back against the tree trunk, hands raised in a futile attempt at defense. The figure crouched down, and in the fading light, Rebecca could finally see his face. High cheekbones, copper skin, dark eyes that studied her with an intensity that felt like a physical touch. A Comanche warrior, his long black hair adorned with a single eagle feather, regarded her with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Rebecca had heard stories of the Comanche, or rather, she had read about them in books and newspapers. Fierce warriors, enemies of the white settlers, savages, according to men like William Thornton, but the man before her didn't reach for a weapon. Instead, he extended a hand, palm up, in a gesture that transcended the barriers of language and silence. In that moment, suspended between life and death, Rebecca made a choice. She placed her trembling hand in his. The Comanche, who she would later learn was called Nako, lifted her effortlessly to her feet. When her legs buckled, he caught her, supporting her weight with a strength that seemed boundless. He gestured toward the darkened forest, then to himself, a question in his eyes. Rebecca nodded, understanding the universal language of survival, follow or die. As Nako led her deeper into the forest, Rebecca felt something stir within her. Not hope, not yet, but perhaps its distant cousin. A refusal to surrender to the fate William Thornton and the others had prescribed for her. If she was going to die, it would not be as the helpless deaf woman they believed her to be. The journey through Whispering Pines Forest was a blur of exhaustion and pain. Nako moved with the confidence of someone who knew these woods intimately, while Rebecca stumbled behind, her body pushed beyond its limits. Several times, he stopped to allow her to rest, offering her sips from a water skin that tasted of smoke and herbs. When they finally reached a small clearing where a modest fire burned, Rebecca nearly wept with relief. Round the fire sat 3 other Comanche, an older woman, a young man barely out of boyhood, and a girl of perhaps 12 summers. They looked up as Nako approached, their expressions shifting from wariness to curiosity as they took in Rebecca's bedraggled form. Nako helped her sit near the fire, its warmth a shock to her frozen skin. The older woman approached, her movements deliberate and slow, as if sensing Rebecca's fear. She knelt beside her, examining the cuts on her hands and the bruises that bloomed across her wrists where the settlers had gripped her. Rebecca watched the woman's lips move as she spoke to Nako, but without Daniel to interpret, the words remained a mystery. Her isolation felt absolute in that moment, unable to hear the language of the settlers who had rejected her, and now equally unable to understand these people who had saved her. But then something unexpected happened. The older woman placed a hand on Rebecca's shoulder, drawing her attention. When she was certain Rebecca was watching, she pointed to herself and made a gesture, hand to mouth, then heart. A name, Rebecca realized. A name in the language of hands. With trembling fingers, Rebecca imitated the gesture, then pointed to the woman questioningly. The woman nodded, a smile spreading across her weathered face. She repeated the gesture, hand, to mouth, then heart, and then spoke a word that Rebecca could read on her lips, Makia. For the first time since Daniel's death, Rebecca felt something loosen in her chest. Here, among those the settlers called savages, someone understood that silence did not equal emptiness, that hands could speak as eloquently as voices. With newfound urgency, Rebecca pointed to herself and then spelled out her name as Daniel had taught her, the finger shapes that represented her identity in a world that often refused to see her. To her astonishment, Nako watched her movements intently, then imitated her gestures with surprising accuracy. He pointed to her and repeated the finger shapes, a question in his eyes. Rebecca nodded, a single tear tracking down her dirt-streaked face. In that simple exchange, she had been acknowledged in a way the settlers of Clearwater Valley never had. As the night deepened around them and the fire cast long shadows across the clearing, Rebecca watched the interactions between Nako, Makia, and the younger Comanche. They spoke with their hands as much as their voices, a complex system of gestures that seemed to flow naturally between them. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It wasn't the formal sign language Daniel had learned from a deaf educator in Boston, but it served the same purpose: connection. Rebecca drifted in and out of consciousness, her body surrendering to the exhaustion that had been her constant companion for days. But before sleep claimed her completely, she felt a rough blanket being draped over her shoulders and a bowl of something warm pressed into her hands. "Eat," Nako mouthed clearly, demonstrating with his own hands the act of bringing food to his mouth. The stew was unfamiliar, gamey and rich with roots and berries she couldn't identify, but it was nourishment, freely given without expectation or judgment. Rebecca ate until the bowl was empty, each bite restoring not just her strength, but something more fundamental: her humanity. That night, as she slept beside the fire in the camp of people she had been taught to fear, Rebecca dreamed of Daniel. He was smiling, his hands moving in the patterns that had built their private world together. "You were always stronger than you knew," his dream hands told her. "Now they'll see it too." She woke to the soft light of dawn filtering through. The pine branches above, momentarily disoriented. The events of the previous day came rushing back. Her expulsion from Clearwater Valley, her collapse in the forest, Nako finding her, the unexpected kindness of the Comanche camp. Makia was already awake, tending to the fire with practiced movements. She looked up as Rebecca stirred, offering a slight nod before returning to her task. The others were nowhere to be seen, but Rebecca could make out the signs of recent activity. Freshly cleaned hides stretched on frames, a half-finished basket, weapons laid out with care. Rebecca sat up slowly, her body protesting each movement. Despite the food and rest, she was still dangerously weak. Years of living without sound had taught her to be intensely observant, to read situations through visual cues alone. Now, she studied the camp with the same attention to detail. This wasn't a permanent settlement, she realized. The structures were too minimal, the possessions too carefully selected for easy transport. A hunting party, perhaps, or scouts, which meant they would be moving on, leaving her behind just as the settlers had. The thought sent a wave of panic through her. She wasn't ready to be alone again. Not yet. But what claim did she have on these people? They owed her nothing. As if sensing her distress, Makia approached, carrying a small pouch. She sat beside Rebecca and opened it to reveal a mixture of dried herbs and berries. With patient gestures, she demonstrated how to chew them, pointing to Rebecca's cracked lips and sunburned skin. Rebecca accepted the medicine hesitantly, placing a small amount in her mouth as instructed. The taste was bitter but not unpleasant, and almost immediately, she felt a cooling sensation spread across her damaged skin. While she processed this small kindness, movement at the edge of the clearing caught her attention. Nako was returning, a freshly killed rabbit slung over his shoulder. Behind him walked the young boy, carrying an armful of firewood. They moved, with the silent efficiency of those accustomed to danger, their eyes constantly scanning the surrounding forest. When Nako spotted Rebecca awake, he approached, crouching down to meet her at eye level, a consideration she rarely experienced from hearing people who often spoke to her from standing height, making it impossible to read their lips. He pointed to the rabbit, then to her, then made a gesture of strength, fists clenched, arms flexed, food for strength. Rebecca touched her heart in thanks, the gesture transcending the barriers between them. But uncertainty plagued her. What would happen when she regained that strength? Where would she go? As if reading the questions in her eyes, Nako made a series of gestures, pointing to the sun, moving his hand in an arc across the sky, then pointing to the ground where they sat. Stay until the sun completes its journey. Stay for the day. One day. It wasn't much, but it was more than she had dared hope for. Rebecca nodded, relief washing over her in a wave so powerful it nearly brought tears to her eyes. Throughout that day, Rebecca observed the rhythms of the small Comanche group. Makia seemed to be the healer and keeper of knowledge, her hands constantly busy with plants and medicines. The young boy, who Nako referred to as Taabe through gestures, was clearly an apprentice of sorts, watching the adults with keen eyes and imitating their skills. The girl, whose name sign involved a motion like flowing water that Rebecca later understood to be Napua, maintained a cautious distance, though her curiosity was evident in the way she watched Rebecca when she thought no one was looking. Nako himself was clearly the leader, respected by the others, and final arbiter in decisions. But there was no cruelty in his authority, no sense of the arbitrary power that men like William Thornton wielded in Clearwater Valley. As the day progressed, Rebecca found small ways to make herself useful, despite her weakness. She helped Makia prepare the rabbit, her fingers remembering the skills her mother had taught her long ago. She sorted herbs under the older woman's watchful eye, learning through observation which plants were valued for medicine and which for food. With each task, Rebecca felt a piece of herself returning, not the woman who had depended on Daniel as her interpreter, nor the desperate creature the settlers had cast out, but someone new, someone who could exist in the silence on her own terms. As evening approached, Nako returned from another hunting expedition, this time with a decision written clearly on his face. He gathered the small group around the fire, including Rebecca, and began to speak and sign simultaneously. Though she couldn't understand all the gestures, Rebecca grasped enough to realize they were discussing her fate. Makia gestured toward Rebecca's still healing hands, then to the darkening sky, a clear argument for allowing her to stay longer. Tabe nodded in agreement, but Napua's expression remained guarded, her signs sharp and quick. Nako listened to, each of them his face impassive. Then he turned to Rebecca, his dark eyes searching hers for something she couldn't name. He pointed to her, then made a series of gestures that she interpreted as a question. "What will you do?" It was a question Rebecca had been asking herself since Daniel's death, a question that had haunted her as she struggled to survive alone, as the settlers turned their backs on her, as she collapsed in the forest, believing her life was over. Now, facing this man who had saved her life but owed her nothing more, Rebecca found an answer rising within her like a flame. She pointed to herself, then mimicked Makia's movements with the herbs, Tabe's careful construction of snares, Nako's own silent tracking through the forest. Then she pointed to her ears, shook her head, and placed her hand over her heart. "I cannot hear, but I can learn. I can contribute. I have value." For a long moment Nako was still, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he nodded. He pointed to the east, made a walking motion with his fingers, then held up 5 fingers. 5 days' journey. He pointed to Rebecca, to himself, to the others, and made the walking motion again. The meaning was clear. When they moved on in 5 days, she would come with them. Rebecca pressed her hand to her heart, hoping he could read the gratitude in her eyes that she couldn't express in words he would understand. But Nako wasn't finished. He leaned forward, his gaze intense, and pointed to her, then to his own eyes, ears, and hands in succession. Finally, he pointed to the forest around them and made a sweeping gesture that encompassed everything: trees, sky, earth. The message took shape in Rebecca's mind with startling clarity. You will learn to see, to sense, to touch the world in new ways. You will learn to survive. It wasn't charity he was offering. It was knowledge, independence, a way to exist in a world that had repeatedly tried to erase her. As the fire crackled between them, casting golden light across faces that had been strangers mere hours before, Rebecca felt something take root inside her, something that had withered in the wake of Daniel's death and the settlers' cruelty. Hope, not the fragile hope of being rescued or protected, but the fierce hope of becoming something new, something unbreakable. The Rebecca Collins who had arrived in Clearwater Valley had depended on others to navigate a world designed for the hearing. The Rebecca who had been cast out had nearly surrendered to despair and death. But this Rebecca, the one who sat among the Comanche as the stars emerged above Whispering Pines Forest, this Rebecca would learn to thrive in the silence. And one day she would return to show those who had discarded her exactly what they had thrown away. As if sensing her resolve, Nako offered her a small knife, its handle worn smooth with use. Rebecca accepted it with steady hands, understanding the gift for what it was, not just a tool for survival, but a promise. The world had tried to write her story for her, casting her as victim, burden, outcast. But as she closed her fingers around the knife's handle, Rebecca made a silent vow. From now on, she would write her own. Dawn broke over Eagle's Ridge with streaks of amber and rose painting the sky. Rebecca woke before the others, her body still accustomed to the rhythms of frontier life despite her exhaustion. 5 days had passed since Nako had found her collapsed beneath the pine tree. 5 days of small meals, careful healing, and watchful eyes. Today, they would break camp and journey to the Comanche winter settlement, a prospect that filled Rebecca with equal parts anticipation and dread. She sat up slowly, her muscles protesting less than they had the day before. The fire had died to embers overnight, its warmth replaced by the crisp chill of early morning. Rebecca pulled the buffalo hide. Blanket Makya had given her tighter around her shoulders and observed the sleeping forms of her unexpected companions. Makya lay near the remains of the fire, her weathered face peaceful in sleep. Taabe was curled on his side, one hand still gripping the small carving he'd been working on the previous evening. Napua slept apart from the others, her back to a tree trunk, ever vigilant even in rest. Nako was absent, likely scouting the path ahead as he had done each morning. Rebecca had spent these 5 days in a state of careful observation, storing away every gesture, every expression, every skill demonstrated around her. Without words to guide her, she relied entirely on visual learning, a skill honed over a lifetime of silence. She had begun to recognize patterns in their hand language, to associate specific movements with objects and actions. It wasn't the same as the formal sign language Daniel had learned for her, but it served its purpose, bridging the gap between her world and theirs. Carefully, she rose and made her way to the small stream that ran near the camp. The morning air bit at her exposed skin, a reminder of the approaching winter. Rebecca knelt by the water, studying her reflection in its clear surface. The woman who looked back at her was both familiar and strange. Thinner, certainly, with hollows beneath her cheekbones that hadn't been there before Daniel's death. But there was something else, something in the set of her jaw and the steadiness of her gaze that spoke of a hardening within, a transformation born of necessity. A slight movement in the water's reflection caught her attention. Rebecca tensed, but didn't turn immediately, another lesson learned from watching Nahko. Instead, she shifted her focus, using her peripheral vision to identify the source of the movement while appearing absorbed in her task. Napua stood several paces behind, observing with the cautious curiosity of youth. The girl had maintained her distance during Rebecca's time in the camp, her expression alternating between suspicion and interest. Now, seeming to realize she had been noticed, Napua approached the stream and knelt beside Rebecca, her movements deliberate and proud. Up close, Rebecca could see the intricate beadwork on Napua's clothing, the careful braiding of her dark hair. The girl was perhaps 13 or 14, old enough to have begun assuming adult responsibilities within the tribe, but young enough that wariness still outweighed diplomacy in her interactions. Napua pointed to Rebecca's tangled hair, then to her own neatly braided locks, a question in her gestures. Rebecca nodded, understanding the offer. She turned away from the stream, allowing Napua access to her hair, an act of trust that felt significant in the moment. The girl's fingers moved with surprising gentleness, working through the knots accumulated during Rebecca's ordeal with patient determination. As Napua worked, she began to speak, perhaps not realizing that Rebecca couldn't hear her words, but Rebecca could feel the vibrations of the girl's voice, could see the reflection of her moving lips in the stream's surface. There was something soothing about the one-sided conversation, a normalcy that had been absent from Rebecca's life since Daniel's passing. When Napua finished, she guided Rebecca to look at her reflection again. The transformation was subtle but meaningful. Her hair now neatly braided in the Comanche style, adorned with a small wooden bead that Napua had removed from her own braid. The gesture transcended the barriers of language and culture, a small kindness from a girl who had every reason to view Rebecca with suspicion. Rebecca touched the braid, then placed her hand over her heart, the gesture of thanks she had seen, used among the Comanche. Napua's expression remained serious, but something in her eyes softened slightly. She pointed to Rebecca, then to the camp, her meaning clear. Time to return. As they approached the clearing, Rebecca saw that Makia and Taabe were already awake and preparing for the day's journey. Nako had returned as well, engaged in conversation with an unfamiliar Comanche warrior who had apparently arrived while Rebecca was at the stream. The newcomer noticed her immediately, his hand dropping instinctively to the knife at his belt. His expression darkened as he spoke rapidly to Nako, gesturing toward Rebecca with obvious displeasure. Rebecca couldn't hear the exchange, but the tension was evident in the set of Nako's shoulders, the tightening of his jaw. He responded with measured gestures, occasionally pointing to Rebecca or to Makia, who had stepped forward to join the conversation. The older woman's hands moved in emphatic patterns that even Rebecca could recognize as defensive. The argument, for it was clearly that, continued for several minutes, with the newcomer growing increasingly agitated. Finally, Nako raised his hand in a gesture that brooked no further discussion. He turned toward Rebecca, his expression carefully neutral as he approached her. With deliberate movements, he explained what she had already surmised. Some among the Comanche did not approve of bringing a white woman to their winter camp. The newcomer, whose name sign Nako demonstrated as a cutting motion across the forearm, Quinai, she would later learn, meaning eagle, was particularly opposed. Nako pointed to Rebecca, then to himself, then made a gesture of wrapping something in a protective embrace. "My responsibility," he seemed to say. Then he pointed to her, to his eyes, and swept his hand across the camp in a gathering motion. You must observe, learn, contribute. The message was clear. Her presence would be tolerated, but she would need to prove her worth. Any burden she created would fall on Nako, who had made himself her advocate. Rebecca straightened her spine, lifting her chin in acknowledgement. She pointed to herself, then mimicked the various tasks she had observed during her time in the camp, tanning hides, preparing food, gathering firewood. She would not be a burden. Nako's expression remained unchanged, but she thought she detected a flicker of approval in his dark eyes. He nodded once, then turned away to continue preparations for departure. Within the hour, the small camp had been dismantled, all traces of their presence erased with an efficiency that impressed Rebecca despite her frontier experience. The Comanche traveled light, carrying only what was essential, leaving nothing behind that might mark their passage. The journey to the winter camp was arduous, especially for Rebecca, whose strength had not fully returned. They traveled through dense forest and across small streams, keeping to natural pathways that would hide their tracks from potential enemies. Guignay led the way, his posture rigid with disapproval whenever his gaze fell on Rebecca. Nako walked beside her for much of the journey, slowing his natural pace to accommodate her limitations. By midday, the terrain had begun to change, the flat plains giving way to rolling hills dotted with stands of pine and oak. Rebecca's legs ached and her breath came in painful gasps, but she refused to show weakness. Each step was a statement of her determination to survive, to adapt, to become something more than the burden Clearwater Valley had deemed her to be. They stopped briefly to rest near a small spring, where Makia insisted on examining Rebecca's still healing hands. The older woman applied a pungent salve from her medicine pouch, her touch gentle but firm. Rebecca watched her work, memorizing the consistency of the mixture, the plants it contained. Knowledge meant survival, and she intended to absorb every lesson this new life offered. As they prepared to continue their journey, Taabe approached her with a walking stick he had fashioned from a sturdy branch, its surface stripped of bark and polished smooth. He demonstrated how to use it to test the ground ahead, to maintain balance on uneven terrain. The gesture was practical rather than pitying, and Rebecca accepted it with gratitude, understanding that it was not charity but a tool to prevent her from slowing their progress. The afternoon brought new challenges as the path wound upward, becoming steeper and more treacherous. Loose rocks skittered beneath their feet, and narrow passages required careful navigation. Rebecca found herself increasingly reliant on her other senses. The feel of the wind changing direction, the subtle variations in temperature that indicated shifting terrain, the vibrations of footsteps through the earth. Without sound to warn her of danger, she developed a heightened awareness of her surroundings, noting how Nako constantly scanned the horizon, how Guignay tested the air for scents carried on the breeze. She began to understand that her deafness, while a disadvantage in some ways, had trained her to observe details that others might miss. The slight tensing of muscles before action, the almost imperceptible changes in expression that signaled emotion. By late afternoon, as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, they crested a ridge to reveal a valley sheltered by towering cliffs. Nestled within this natural fortress was the Comanche winter camp, a collection of teepees, arranged in a circular pattern, with horses grazing in a meadow nearby and smoke rising from cooking fires. Rebecca paused, momentarily overwhelmed by the sight. This wasn't the small hunting party she had been living with. This was an entire community. Dozens of people moved through the camp, engaged in the daily activities of tribal life. Children played near the central fire, women worked at tanning racks, warriors maintained weapons and tended to horses. Nako touched her arm lightly, drawing her attention. His expression was somber as he pointed toward the camp, then to her, then made a gesture of caution. "Be careful," he seemed to say. Not all will welcome you. Rebecca nodded, understanding. She was entering a world few white settlers ever saw, and she did so not as a visitor, but as someone seeking belonging. The path would not be easy. As they descended into the valley, their arrival was quickly noticed. Activity in the camp slowed as faces turned toward them, expressions ranging from curiosity to open hostility. A group of warriors moved to intercept. Them, led by an older man whose bearing marked him as someone of importance. The greeting party stopped several paces away, creating a space where the two groups could assess each other. Queenai immediately stepped forward, speaking rapidly and gesturing toward Rebecca with obvious disapproval. The older leader listened, his weathered face impassive, before turning his attention to Nako. What followed was a lengthy exchange that Rebecca could only interpret through body language and expression. Nako spoke with the measured cadence of someone choosing his words carefully, occasionally indicating Rebecca with a gesture that seemed neither defensive nor apologetic, simply factual. Makia joined the conversation at points, her presence lending weight to whatever argument Nako was making. Finally, the older leader approached Rebecca directly. His face was a map of experience, deep lines etching the history of his years into skin burnished by sun and wind. He studied her with eyes that missed nothing, not the braid Napua had crafted, nor the walking stick from Tabe, nor the healing salve on her hands applied by Makia. He spoke a single word, which she read on his lips as she had learned to do with Daniel, Peter. Then he touched his chest, a name. Rebecca mimicked the gesture, touching her own chest, before carefully forming the signs Daniel had taught her for her name. Peter watched her hands move, his expression thoughtful. Then, to her surprise, he responded with a simple gesture. Hand to mouth, then heart, the same greeting Makia had offered days earlier. The tension in the air eased slightly. Peter turned to address the gathered Comanche, his voice carrying across the valley, though Rebecca could not hear it. Whatever he said caused a ripple of reaction, some nodding in agreement, others turning away in disapproval. When he finished speaking, Peter motioned for Nako to bring Rebecca into the camp. As they walked between the rows of teepees, Rebecca felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon her, some curious, some fearful, some openly resentful. Children paused in their play to stare, women whispered behind raised hands, warriors assessed her with the calculating gaze of those who had learned to view all outsiders as potential threats. Nako led her to a small teepee at the edge of the camp, one that had clearly been prepared in haste. Inside was a simple sleeping mat, a small fire pit, and basic cooking implements. Not luxury by any measure, but far more than Rebecca had possessed. When Nako found her dying in the forest, he pointed to the teepee, then to her, making it clear this would be her shelter. Then he indicated the larger camp with a sweeping gesture, followed by a series of mimicked activities: cooking, tanning, gathering. Her duties were clear: contribute, learn, adapt. Nako hesitated before leaving, his expression uncharacteristically uncertain. Finally, he pointed to the setting sun, then to the ground where they stood, then raised one finger. Tomorrow, he seemed to say, we begin tomorrow. Left alone in the unfamiliar shelter, Rebecca settled onto the sleeping mat, exhaustion flooding through her. The events of the day, the tension with Queenai, the arduous journey, the arrival at the Comanche camp, had drained what little reserves of strength she had built during her recovery. Yet as she stared into the small fire that had been lit in the center of the teepee, Rebecca felt a strange sense of purpose taking root within her. Here, among people who had every reason to reject her, she had been given something Clearwater Valley had denied her a chance. Not charity, not pity, but an opportunity to prove her worth on terms that had nothing to do with her deafness. Here, her value would be measured by what she could contribute, what she could learn, how she could adapt. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky beyond the smoke hole of the teepee, Rebecca made a silent promise to herself. She would learn everything Nako and the Comanche could teach her. She would absorb their skills, their knowledge, their ways of surviving in a land that showed no mercy to the unprepared. And one day, when she was ready, she would return to Clearwater Valley, not as the helpless deaf woman they had cast out, but as someone they would be forced to recognize. Someone who had survived despite their certainty that she would perish. Someone who had found strength in the very silence they had deemed her greatest weakness. The morning arrived with a swift clarity that was becoming familiar to Rebecca. In the Comanche camp, life began before dawn, a necessity born of survival, rather than virtue. She rose from her sleeping mat, muscles stiff from the previous day's journey, but mind alert and ready. Outside her teepee, the camp was already in motion. Women moved between cook fires, preparing the morning meal. Warriors gathered in small groups, discussing hunting plans or patrol routes. Children carried water from the nearby stream, their small faces serious with responsibility. Rebecca stood uncertainly at the entrance to her shelter, aware of the sideways glances and whispered comments her presence generated. Without Daniel to interpret, without words to bridge the gap between her and this community, she felt the weight of her isolation more keenly than she had in days. Then a familiar figure approached, Makia, her weathered face set in its usual expression of pragmatic determination. The older woman didn't waste time on greetings. She simply took Rebecca's arm and led her toward a group of women working at the edge of the camp, where large hides were stretched on frames for tanning. The women looked up as Makia approached with Rebecca, their expressions varying from curiosity to open hostility. One, younger than the others, with a child bound to her back in a cradleboard, said something that made several others laugh sharply. Though Rebecca couldn't hear the words, the contempt in the young mother's face transcended language. Makia responded with a sharp gesture that silenced the laughter immediately. Then she positioned Rebecca beside one of the tanning frames and demonstrated the proper technique for scraping the hide, a motion that required strength and precision in equal measure. Rebecca observed carefully, then took the bone scraper Makia offered. The tool felt awkward in her hands at first, too large and unwieldy for her still healing palms. Her first attempts were clumsy, lacking the smooth efficiency of the Comanche. Women's movements. The young mother with the child made no attempt to hide her derision, mimicking Rebecca's awkward motions with exaggerated gestures that drew snickers from some of the others. Shame burned hot in Rebecca's chest, a familiar feeling from the days in Clearwater Valley when her deafness had made her the target of similar mockery. But shame was a luxury she could not afford now. Survival depended on learning these skills, regardless of how many failed attempts it might take. Setting her jaw, Rebecca adjusted her grip on the scraper and tried again, focusing on replicating the exact angle and pressure Makia had demonstrated. This time, the motion felt more natural, the tool an extension of her arm rather than a foreign object. Makia nodded in approval, then moved away to attend to her own work, leaving Rebecca to continue practicing under the watchful eyes of the other women. For hours, Rebecca worked at the tanning frame, her arms aching, her back screaming in protest. The sun climbed higher in the sky, its heat a welcome relief against the morning chill, but increasingly uncomfortable as noon approached. The other women took breaks to drink water or check on children, but Rebecca continued steadily, determined to prove herself useful. She was aware of them watching her, their initial contempt gradually shifting to reluctant acknowledgement of her persistence. By midday, when Makia returned to check on her progress, Rebecca had scraped a significant portion of the hide to an acceptable standard. Not perfect, far from it, but evidence of a genuine effort to learn. The older woman examined her work, with critical eyes, correcting technique where needed, but offering a small nod of approval before leading her away from the tanning frames. Rebecca's hands were raw, her shoulders knotted with tension, but there was a small sense of accomplishment in having completed the task. Makia brought her to a cooking fire, where a pot of stew bubbled, gesturing for her to eat. As Rebecca accepted the wooden bowl offered to her, she became aware of a presence at her side. Napua had appeared silently, settling beside her with the bowl of stew. The girl didn't acknowledge Rebecca directly, her gaze fixed on the food, but her deliberate choice to sit near the white woman rather than with her own peers spoke volumes. As they ate, Rebecca observed the rhythms of the camp at midday. Warriors returned from morning hunts or patrols, bringing game or reports. Children played games that seemed designed to develop skills they would need as adults: tracking, stalking, identifying plants. Elders sat in the shade, weaving baskets or working on beadwork while observing the activities around them. It was a community functioning with the synchronized efficiency of long practice, each person fulfilling roles determined by age, gender, and ability. Rebecca wondered where, if anywhere, she might eventually fit within this carefully balanced structure. Her musings were interrupted by Nahko's arrival. He approached with his usual measured stride, acknowledging Makia with a respectful nod before turning his attention to Rebecca. With gestures now becoming increasingly familiar to her, he indicated that it was time for her next lesson. Rebecca rose, ignoring the protest of her tired muscles, and followed Nahko away from the main camp toward a small clearing near the stream. There, to her surprise, waited Taabe and several other young Comanche, both boys and girls, ranging in age from perhaps 10 to 16 years. Nahko positioned himself in the center of the group and began what was clearly a demonstration. He crouched low to the ground, his movements becoming fluid and silent as he demonstrated how to move through the forest without creating disturbance. The children watched intently, then mimicked his actions when he gestured for them to try. Rebecca realized with a start that she had been brought to a training session for the younger members of the tribe, a session focused on skills that relied not on hearing, but on sight, touch, and instinct. When Nahko caught her eye, there was the barest hint of understanding in his expression. He was offering her not just practical knowledge, but a path forward, one that acknowledged her deafness not as a disability, but as a different way of experiencing the world. For the remainder of the afternoon, Rebecca participated in the training alongside the Comanche children. They learned to identify animal tracks, to distinguish between similar-looking plants by subtle differences in leaf pattern or stem structure, to read the direction of wind from the movement of grass and branches. The younger children were initially wary of her, staying close to Taabe or the other older youths. But as the afternoon progressed, curiosity began to overcome caution. One small girl, no more than 7 years old, approached Rebecca hesitantly. During a break in the lesson, the child pointed to Rebecca's ears, then to her own, her face a question mark. Rebecca gently took the girl's hand and placed it against her own throat, then made a humming sound she could feel but not hear. The vibration traveled through her hand to the child's small fingers. Then she placed her own hand against the girl's throat and gestured for her to speak. The child's eyes widened as understanding dawned. She said something. Rebecca could feel the vibration but not hear the words, then took Rebecca's hand and pressed it against different objects nearby: a tree trunk, the ground, a rock. Each time, she would tap or scratch the surface, allowing Rebecca to feel the vibrations traveling through different materials. It was a game to the child, but to Rebecca, it was a revelation. The girl had instinctively understood something that the adults of Clearwater Valley never had. That deafness wasn't an absence, but a different way of experiencing the physical world. Other children gradually joined the impromptu lesson, their initial wariness dissolving into curiosity. They took turns generating vibrations for Rebecca to feel, laughing in delight when she correctly identified their sources. It became a challenge among them to create more complex patterns for her to decipher. Nako observed this interaction from a distance, his expression unreadable, but his attention unwavering. When the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, he called the children back to continue their training with a series of hand gestures that Rebecca was beginning to recognize as part of the Comanche Sign Language. The remainder of the afternoon passed in a blur of new knowledge. Rebecca learned to identify which plants could be eaten, which had medicinal properties, and which should be avoided at all costs. She learned to recognize the subtle depressions in grass that indicated recent passage of deer or elk, to distinguish between the tracks of predator and prey. Most importantly, she began to understand that survival in this harsh land depended not on strength alone, but on observation, the ability to read the subtle signs that the natural world constantly provided. As the light faded and the group prepared to return to the main camp, Nako approached Rebecca directly. He pointed to her, then to the knowledge they had shared that day, then made a gesture she hadn't seen before, hands open, rising slowly, like smoke from a fire. The meaning wasn't immediately clear until Taabe, watching nearby, stepped forward and repeated the gesture with a single word Rebecca could read on his lips. Tomorrow. Learning. They would continue tomorrow. The days that followed fell into a pattern that became Rebecca's new normal. Mornings were spent with Makia and the other women, learning the practical skills necessary for daily survival. Tanning hides, preparing food, crafting clothing from animal skins and plant fibers. Afternoons belonged to Nako's lessons in tracking, hunting and reading the natural world. The initial hostility she faced from many in the camp didn't disappear entirely, but it gradually softened into a cautious acceptance. Her willingness to work without complaint, to learn despite the barriers of language and culture, earned her a grudging respect from those who had expected her to fail. Even Quinai, who had opposed her presence from the beginning, seemed to moderate his disapproval as weeks passed. He still watched her with suspicious eyes, still kept his distance, but the open contempt had faded to something closer to wary tolerance. Napua became an unexpected ally, seeking Rebecca out during mealtimes or in the evenings. The girl's initial reserve had transformed into a kind of protective curiosity. She taught Rebecca the Comanche signs for common objects and actions, correcting her with the blunt honesty of youth when she made mistakes. Through Napua, Rebecca began to piece together a new language, one that existed in the realm of the visual rather than the auditory. It wasn't the formal sign language she had learned with Daniel, nor was it exactly the same as the sign language used among the Plains tribes. It was something in between, adapted to her specific needs and situation. With this growing ability to communicate came stories, told through sign, through facial expression, through the drawing of images in the dirt. Rebecca learned about the Comanche people, their migrations following the buffalo herds, their conflicts with other tribes and with the encroaching white settlers. She learned about Nako's status as a respected warrior, about Makia's reputation as a healer, about Peta's leadership and the decisions that had brought the band to this winter camp. In return, Rebecca shared her own story, the death of her parents when she was 16, her marriage to Daniel, who had learned to speak to her with his hands, their journey west in search of land and independence, the cruelty of Clearwater Valley after Daniel's death. The telling was cathartic, transforming her experiences from a tangle of pain and loss into a narrative she could hold at a distance, examine, and begin to understand. In the act of sharing, she reclaimed her own history. As winter deepened, blanketing the valley in snow and sending temperatures plunging, life in the camp became increasingly focused on survival. Hunting parties went out daily, seeking game that was becoming scarcer as animals retreated to sheltered areas or migrated south, Stores of dried meat, berries, and roots were carefully rationed to ensure they would last until spring brought renewed abundance. Rebecca found herself increasingly included in the daily activities of the camp, her skills now valued enough that her participation was expected rather than merely tolerated. She had learned to make pemmican, a concentrated mixture of dried meat, fat, and berries that provided essential nutrition during the lean winter months. Her hands, once soft from life as a settler's wife, had developed calluses and strength from constant work. More significantly, she had begun to adapt to life without sound in ways she hadn't imagined possible before. Where once she had relied on Daniel to be her connection to the hearing world, she now navigated her environment independently, reading visual cues that others missed because they depended too heavily on their hearing. She knew from the sudden alertness of the horses when strangers approached the camp, from the shift in air pressure when a storm was building, from the subtle changes in behavior among the wildlife when danger threatened. Her vision had become sharper, her sense of touch more discerning, her awareness of vibration through the ground more acute. One evening, as the band gathered around the central fire for the evening meal, Peter approached Rebecca directly. The elderly leader had maintained a distance since her arrival, watching her progress, but rarely interacting with her personally. Now, he seated himself beside her, his weathered face serious in the flickering firelight. Using the signs she had learned over the past weeks, he asked her a question that took her by surprise. Why had the people of Clearwater Valley feared her silence? Rebecca considered the question carefully. It wasn't something she had articulated before, even to herself. Finally, with measured gestures, she explained that many hearing people were uncomfortable with difference, that her deafness reminded them of their own vulnerability, their own potential for loss. Fear often turned to cruelty when people confronted in things they didn't understand. Peter nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. Then he shared a story of his own, one about the Comanche belief that those who experienced the world differently often possessed gifts that others lacked. A person born without sight might develop extraordinary hearing, becoming able to detect approaching enemies from distances that seemed impossible. A warrior injured in battle might lose the use of his legs, but gain wisdom that benefited the entire tribe. Difference, in the Comanche worldview, was not something to be feared, but something to be understood and integrated into the strength of the community as a whole. As Peter finished his story, Rebecca felt something shift within her, a realization that her deafness, which Clearwater Valley had seen as a burden, might actually be the source of abilities that had allowed her to survive and adapt when others might have perished. The silence that had defined her life was not an absence but a presence, shaping her perception in ways that gave her unique insights and strengths. That night, as she lay in her teepee watching snowflakes drift through the smoke hole to disappear in the dying embers of her fire, Rebecca made a decision. When spring came, when the passes cleared and travel became possible again, she would ask Nahko to teach her one final skill, how to make the journey back to Clearwater Valley alone, not to beg for acceptance or to reclaim what had been taken from her, but to show those who had discarded her exactly what they had thrown away. A woman who had learned to turn silence into strength, isolation into independence, rejection into resilience. Winter's grip tightened around Eagle's Ridge as February brought storms that buried the Comanche camp beneath drifts taller than a man. For nearly 3 days, the blizzard raged, forcing everyone to remain inside their teepees, venturing out only when absolutely necessary to care for the horses or retrieve supplies. Inside her small shelter, Rebecca stoked the fire and practiced the finger-weaving Makia had taught her, creating a sash from strands of dyed horsehair. The isolation of the storm reminded her of her first weeks after Daniel's death. But the feeling was different now. Then she had been drowning in grief and fear. Now she worked with steady hands, secure in the knowledge that she could survive. The storm would pass, and life would continue. She had earned her place here, not through charity or pity, but through demonstrated value and determination. When the skies finally cleared, revealing a world transformed by snow, the camp emerged from hibernation with renewed purpose. Game had become scarce, and their stored provisions were dwindling faster than anticipated. The harsh weather had lasted longer than even the eldest members of the tribe had experienced, and concern etched itself into faces that rarely showed emotion. Peter called a council meeting around the central fire, inviting all adults to participate. In the discussion, to Rebecca's surprise, Nako approached her teepee and gestured for her to join them. It was an acknowledgement she hadn't expected, an inclusion that spoke of her changing status within the community. The circle around the fire parted slightly as she approached, creating a space where she could observe the speakers' faces and hand gestures. Peter stood at the center, his aged frame somehow more imposing in the firelight as he outlined the situation with direct economic movements that Rebecca had come to associate with Comanche communication. Their food stores would not last until spring if the winter continued at this intensity. Game had retreated to lower elevations that would require traveling through dangerous mountain passes to reach. The horses were growing thin with fodder running low. Decisions needed to be made. Various warriors spoke, offering suggestions. Some advocated for sending a hunting party to the valleys beyond the mountains, despite the risks. Others suggested splitting the band, with some traveling south to join another Comanche group, while others remained to protect their territory. Each proposition carried advantages and disadvantages, weighed carefully in the deliberate manner of those whose survival depended on correct choices. Quinai rose to speak, his powerful frame silhouetted against the fire. He pointed toward the distant mountains, then made a series of gestures that Rebecca interpreted as a proposal to lead a small group of warriors on an extended hunting expedition. They would travel light, move fast, and return with whatever game they could find. Others nodded in agreement, but Nako remained still, his expression thoughtful. When Quinai finished, Nako stood and offered a different perspective. His gestures indicated a journey not west toward the mountains, but east, toward the very settlements from which Rebecca had fled. Rebecca's pulse quickened as she realized what he was suggesting. The settlers at Clearwater Valley and other nearby towns would have stored food for the winter: corn, wheat, preserved meat. A small, skilled party could potentially acquire some of these supplies without direct confrontation. It was a raid, not for vengeance or glory, but for survival. The discussion grew heated, with some supporting Nako's plan, while others favored Quinai's more traditional approach. Raiding settler towns carried significant risk, not just to the warriors involved, but to the entire band if it provoked retribution. Yet hunting in unfamiliar territories during the harshest part of winter held its own dangers. To Rebecca's surprise, Makia rose to support Nako's proposal. The elderly healer rarely spoke at council meetings, making her intervention all the more significant. Her gnarled hands moved with authority as she pointed out that many hunters, even skilled ones, had already returned empty-handed from the western valleys. The settlers, by contrast, would have abundant stores, far more than they needed to survive the winter. As the debate continued, Rebecca felt a growing certainty about what needed to be done. She had knowledge that could be valuable: understanding of settler habits, awareness of where food would be stored, familiarity with the layout of Clearwater Valley and its surrounding farms. Information that could mean the difference between a successful raid and disaster. Without fully considering the consequences, she rose to her feet. The conversation around the fire immediately ceased, all eyes turning toward her with expressions ranging from curiosity to disapproval. Women rarely spoke at council meetings unless specifically invited, and she was not only a woman, but an outsider. Yet she stood firm, waiting until Peter acknowledged her with a slight nod before beginning to sign with the careful precision she had developed over the past months. She knew Clearwater Valley, she explained. She knew which farms had the largest root cellars, which households would have smoked meat hanging in storage sheds, which properties were isolated enough that a small group could approach unseen. She knew the routines of the settlers. When they checked their livestock, when they retired for the evening, when the men gathered at the watering hole, leaving their homes less protected. Most importantly, she knew of a small valley less than a day's ride from Clearwater where the Miller family maintained a hunting cabin, used primarily in autumn, but always stocked with preserved food and supplies. The cabin would be empty at this time of year, its location known to few, its contents undisturbed. As she finished signing, silence hung over the council. Quickneye was the first to break it, his gestures sharp with skepticism. How could they trust her information? What if she led them into a trap? Why would she help them take from her own people? Rebecca met his gaze steadily. With deliberate movements, she explained that Clearwater Valley had ceased to be her people the moment they had cast her out to die. The Comanche had given her life when the settlers had wished her death. Her loyalty now lay with those who had recognized her value when others had seen only her limitations. Nako translated her signs for those who might have missed nuances, his face impassive but his eyes watchful. When he finished, Peter rose again, studying Rebecca with an intensity that seemed to pierce through all pretense. Finally, he asked a question that cut to the heart of the matter. Would she herself guide them to this cabin? Rebecca hesitated only briefly before nodding. Yes, she would. The decision was made swiftly after that. Nako would lead a small party of 4 warriors accompanied by Rebecca to locate the Miller family's hunting cabin and retrieve whatever supplies could be transported by a single pack horse. They would travel at night, avoid detection, and return within 5 days. Quickneye would simultaneously lead a hunting party west, creating a second chance for success should either mission fail. As the council dispersed, Rebecca felt the weight of her commitment settle upon her shoulders. She had just volunteered to return to the vicinity of Clearwater Valley to potentially face the very people who had condemned her to death. More significantly, she had declared her allegiance to the Comanche in terms that could not be misinterpreted. There was no going back now. Preparations began immediately. Nako selected 3 warriors for the expedition. Chaska, a young man, known for his extraordinary night vision. Maka, an older warrior with decades of experience in stealth operations. And Takoda, whose tracking skills were unmatched within the band. Each man carried a specific expertise that would be needed for the mission's success. Rebecca spent the day before their departure with Makia, who insisted on examining her physical condition and preparing medicines they might need during the journey. The elderly healer's fingers probed with gentle efficiency, assessing Rebecca's strength, flexibility, and overall health. "You are stronger now," Makia signed, her weathered face serious. "But this journey will test you in new ways." Rebecca nodded, understanding the unspoken concern. She had come far in the months since Nako had found her half dead in the forest. But she was still not Comanche, not a warrior trained from childhood in the arts of stealth and survival. Her presence on this mission represented both an asset and a liability. As darkness fell, Napua appeared at Rebecca's teepee, carrying a bundle wrapped in soft deerskin. The girl had become something of a shadow in recent weeks, observing Rebecca's activities with keen attention, but maintaining a careful emotional distance. Now she unwrapped the bundle to reveal a pair of moccasins, crafted specifically for winter travel with thick buffalo fur lining and reinforced soles. Rebecca accepted. The gift with genuine surprise, such items required significant time and skill to create. An investment Napua would not have made lightly. As she tried them on, finding them perfectly sized for her feet, she caught sight of something unusual. A small pattern beaded into the toe of each moccasin. A spiral that began at the center and wound outward, worked in blue and white beads. Napua touched the pattern, then pointed to Rebecca's ears, then to her eyes. The meaning became clear. The spiral represented sound moving outward, visible rather than audible. It was a symbol of Rebecca's particular way of experiencing the world, not as lack, but as difference. The gesture left Rebecca momentarily speechless, her hands still as emotion constricted her throat. This wasn't merely a practical gift. It was an acknowledgement of her identity, a recognition of the strength she had found in her silence. She pressed her palm to her heart, then reached out to grasp Napua's hand briefly, a thank you that required no translation. They departed before dawn, slipping away from the camp while most still slept. The sky arched overhead, a vast canopy of stars undimmed by any artificial light, guiding their path as they headed east toward Clearwater Valley. Rebecca rode behind Nako, her newly acquired moccasins wrapped in additional layers of fur to protect against the biting cold. The journey was arduous, the landscape transformed by snow into an endless expanse of white, broken only by the dark silhouettes of trees and rock formations. They traveled in single file, their horses carefully placed in each other's footprints to minimize the trail they left behind. Conversation, even in sign, was kept to a minimum. Energy conserved for the task at hand. By midday they had covered significant ground, the mountains of Eagle's Ridge, now visible only as a distant outline behind them. They paused briefly to rest the horses and eat a small portion of pemmican, the concentrated food providing essential energy while requiring no fire to prepare. As Rebecca chewed the mixture of dried meat, fat, and berries, she found herself studying the faces of her companions. Chaska, barely older than 20, with keen eyes that constantly scanned the horizon. Maka, his face weathered by decades of similar journeys, his movements economical and precise. Takoda, lean and intense, crouched near the ground as he examined, tracks nearly invisible to Rebecca's untrained eye, and Nako, whose quiet authority held the group together without need for overt commands. These men had accepted her presence on this mission despite the risk it represented, trusting her knowledge of settler ways, her familiarity with the territory, her commitment to their shared survival. It was a form of respect she had rarely experienced even before Daniel's death, when her deafness had often caused others to treat her as less capable, less reliable, less complete. As they resumed their journey, the terrain gradually became more familiar. Certain rock formations, the curve of a stream beneath its frozen surface, the pattern of trees along a ridge, all began to trigger memories of her journey with Daniel. Nearly a year earlier, they were approaching the outlying regions of the territory claimed by Clearwater Valley and its neighboring settlements. Rebecca tapped Nako's shoulder, signaling that she needed to communicate. When he turned, she indicated a barely visible trail that branched eastward from their current path. The Miller cabin, she explained through signs, lay approximately 2 hours in that direction, nestled in a small valley protected from the worst of the winter winds. Nako studied the area carefully before nodding. He gestured to Takoda, who dismounted to examine the snow-covered trail. After several minutes of investigation, the tracker confirmed that no one had passed this way since the last snowfall, at least 3 days earlier. The cabin was likely unoccupied, just as Rebecca had predicted. They altered their course accordingly, moving with increased caution as they entered territory more likely to be frequented by settlers. Each ridge was approached with deliberate care. Each open expanse, crossed only after thorough observation, confirmed it was safe to proceed. As the short winter day began to wane, casting long blue shadows across the snow, Rebecca felt a tightening in her chest that had nothing to do with the cold. They were close now, so close she could almost visualize the cabin's squat form nestled against the hillside, its stone chimney, its small covered porch where Edward Miller would sit, cleaning his rifle after a successful hunt. The Miller family, Edward, his wife Margaret, and their 3 sons, had been among those who had voted for her expulsion from Clearwater Valley. Edward had been particularly vocal, claiming that a deaf woman living alone was not only a burden on community resources, but a danger to herself and others. "She can't even hear an Indian approaching," he had said, according to Martha Thornton's gleeful repetition afterward. "Might as well invite them in to scalp us all." The irony of his words was not lost on Rebecca as she now approached his family's cabin alongside 4 Comanche warriors. Naco signaled for them to halt as they reached the final ridge overlooking the small valley. The sun had set, but the snow reflected enough moonlight to illuminate the landscape below. The cabin was visible, just as Rebecca had described it, isolated, sturdy, built to withstand the harsh mountain winters while providing comfort for hunting parties. There was no smoke rising from the chimney, no light visible through the single window, no tracks marring the pristine snow surrounding the structure. As Rebecca had predicted, it appeared to be unoccupied. Still they waited, observing from the ridge for nearly an hour as darkness settled fully over the valley. Only when Naco was completely satisfied that no threat lurked nearby did he signal for them to approach, leaving their horses concealed among the trees at the base of the ridge. The final approach was made on foot, each step carefully placed. To minimize sound and disturbance of the snow, Rebecca moved with a confidence that surprised even herself, her body having absorbed months of lessons in Comanche movement techniques. Where once she had crashed through the forest with settler clumsiness, she now glided like a shadow, her weight distributed in the way Naco had taught her, her senses alert to every detail of her surroundings. The cabin door was secured with a simple wooden latch, locked but easily bypassed by someone with knowledge of settler construction. Rebecca demonstrated how to lift the bar from the outside using a thin blade inserted through the gap above the door. Within moments, they had gained entry to the cabin's dark interior. Maka remained outside as lookout, while the others searched the cabin by touch and with the aid of a small shielded light that Chaska produced from his pack. Rebecca moved directly to the area she knew would contain the most valuable supplies, a trapdoor in the floor near the hearth, leading to a small root cellar where the Millers stored preserved foods. The cellar yielded a bounty beyond their expectations. Jars of preserved fruits and vegetables, sacks of flour and dried beans, slabs of salt pork wrapped in oiled cloth, even several bottles of whiskey that would prove valuable for medicinal purposes. In the corner, they discovered a cache of ammunition and hunting supplies, lead balls, powder, flints, resources that had become increasingly scarce for the Comanche as trade relations with settlers deteriorated. While the men filled their packs with the heavier items, Rebecca explored the main room of the cabin, looking for additional supplies that might be useful. On the shelf near the window, she found something unexpected, a small wooden box containing medical supplies, bandages, needle and thread for stitching wounds, a bottle of laudanum, various tinctures and powders labeled in a neat hand. She recognized Margaret Miller's handwriting, recalling that the woman had served as a midwife and healer for the community before Dr. Porter had established his practice in Clearwater Valley proper. These medical supplies would be invaluable to Makia, whose own stores had been depleted by the unusually harsh winter and the illnesses it had brought. Rebecca added the box to their growing collection, feeling no guilt as she did so. The Millers had voted for her death. They could unknowingly contribute to the survival of those who had saved her life. As they prepared to depart, Dakota discovered one final treasure, a small arsenal of weapons stored in a locked chest beneath one of the beds. The lock proved no obstacle to Comanche skills, revealing 2 rifles, a pistol, and several knives of higher quality than those typically available to the tribe through trade. Nako examined the weapons with appreciation before signaling that it was time to leave. They had accomplished their goal with unexpected success, and now speed was essential. The longer they remained in settler territory, the greater the risk of discovery. Rebecca took one final look around the cabin as the others slipped outside. In the dim light, she could almost see the Miller family moving through the space. Edward cleaning his rifles at the table, Margaret preparing meals at the hearth, the boys arguing over who would sleep in which bed when they came for hunting. Season. It was a life she had once aspired to, the frontier existence she and Daniel had journeyed west to find. Now, it belonged to a past that felt increasingly distant, a world that had rejected her as surely as she was now rejecting it. Outside, the night had deepened, the temperature dropping sharply, as it often did after sunset in the mountains. The men worked quickly to distribute the supplies among their packs, leaving the cabin exactly as they had found it, save for its depleted stores. To a casual observer, there would be no sign of their visit until someone specifically checked the root cellar or the weapons chest. They retreated the way they had come, moving silently through the snow back to where their horses waited. The animals had been well trained for such missions, standing quietly without the nervous whinnying that might have betrayed their position. As they mounted and prepared to depart, Rebecca felt a strange sense of completion. She had returned to the world that had cast her out, not as a supplicant begging to be readmitted, but as someone with agency and purpose, someone who had not merely survived, but found a new path forward. The journey back to Eagle's Ridge was made with greater speed, their mission accomplished, and their primary concern now being to return the valuable supplies to the Comanche camp as quickly as possible. They traveled through the night and into the following day, stopping only when necessary to rest the horses or to eat small portions of their provisions. Rebecca's body ached from the continuous riding, her hands and face stinging from exposure to the cold, despite the protective clothing she wore. Yet there was a satisfaction in the discomfort, a pride in her ability to endure alongside warriors trained from childhood for such journeys. By late afternoon of the second day, they began to encounter the familiar landmarks of Comanche territory. A distinctive rock formation shaped like a bear's head, a frozen waterfall that caught the setting sun like shattered glass, a stand of pines where they had stopped briefly on their outward journey, each signpost bringing them closer to the safety of Eagle's Ridge. As they climbed higher into the mountains, Rebecca noticed Nako growing increasingly alert, his posture tensing as he scanned the trail ahead. Something had caught his attention, something imperceptible to her less experienced senses. He signaled for the group to halt, then dismounted, and moved forward on foot to investigate. The others waited in tense silence, hands moving to weapons as a precaution. After several minutes, Nako returned, his expression grave as he conveyed what he had discovered through signs. Tracks in the snow ahead, not Comanche, but settler. A group of at least 6 men on horseback had passed through recently, heading in the direction of the Comanche winter camp. Alarm surged through Rebecca as the implications became clear. Settlers rarely ventured this far into the mountains during winter, especially in numbers. If they were doing so now, it likely meant they were searching for something or someone. Had their raid on the Miller cabin been discovered sooner than anticipated? Had the settlers somehow traced them back toward Eagle's Ridge? Or was this an unrelated hunting party that had strayed unusually far from Clearwater Valley? Whatever. The explanation, the presence of armed settlers so close to the Comanche camp, represented a serious threat. Even if the men had no hostile intentions, an accidental encounter could quickly escalate into violence, given the tensions that existed between settlers and the indigenous population. Nako made a swift decision. He directed Chaska to continue toward the camp by the most direct route, riding ahead to warn Peter and the others of the potential danger. The rest of them would follow the settlers' trail to determine their numbers, direction, and intent before deciding on further action. As Chaska disappeared into the gathering dusk, Rebecca found herself faced with a choice she hadn't anticipated. Nako did not order her to go with Chaska, as might have been expected. Instead, he looked at her questioningly, leaving the decision in her hands. She could return to the relative safety of the camp, or she could continue with the warriors to investigate the settler incursion. It was a gesture of respect that acknowledged her status as neither fully Comanche nor settler, but as someone whose unique knowledge might prove valuable in the situation ahead. Without hesitation, Rebecca signaled her decision to remain with the tracking party. If these were men from Clearwater Valley, she might recognize them, might understand their purpose in a way the Comanche could not. Nako nodded once, then led them off the main trail and into the forest, following the settlers' tracks with the focused intensity of a predator. The light was fading rapidly now, but Takoda seemed able to read the snow by touch as much as sight, his fingers occasionally brushing the surface to confirm what his eyes detected. They traveled in absolute silence, even the horses seeming to understand the need for stealth as they picked their way carefully through the trees. Rebecca focused on her surroundings with every sense available to her, compensating for her lack of hearing by heightening her awareness of visual cues, the direction of broken twigs, the disturbance of snow on tree branches, the distant movement of birds that might indicate human activity ahead. After nearly an hour of tracking, Mahka signaled for a halt, pointing toward a faint glow visible through the trees ahead. Firelight. The settlers had made camp for the night, apparently unaware that they were being observed. Leaving their horses secured at a safe distance, the four Comanche, for Rebecca now included herself in that category without conscious thought, crept forward on foot. The approach was painstaking, each movement calculated to produce no sound, leave no trace, create no disturbance that might alert those ahead. As they drew closer, the voices of the men around the campfire became visible to Rebecca in the form of vapor clouds in the cold air, speech she couldn't hear but could detect visually. From a position concealed behind a large fallen tree, they finally gained a clear view of the settler camp. 6 men sat around a substantial fire, its size betraying their inexperience in hostile territory. Their horses were tethered nearby, stomping occasionally in the cold. Rifles leaned against logs or lay within easy reach, and each man wore a pistol at his belt, armed for conflict, not merely for hunting. With a jolt of recognition, Rebecca identified William Thornton among them, his patrician profile unmistakable. Even in the inconsistent light of the fire, beside him sat Edward Miller, presumably the owner of the cabin they had raided. The others were familiar as well. All men from Clearwater Valley, all part of the group that had voted for her expulsion. Months earlier, Nako touched her arm lightly, a question in his eyes. Did she know these men? Rebecca nodded, then carefully signed an explanation. These were men from Clearwater Valley, the very settlement that had cast her out. The leader was William Thornton, the most influential man in the community. They were heavily armed and appeared to be searching for something or someone. As if to confirm her assessment, Thornton's voice carried clearly through the still night air. Though Rebecca couldn't hear his words, she had learned to read lips with reasonable accuracy during her years of deafness. What she interpreted sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the winter cold. "Tracks definitely Comanche," Thornton was saying. "Porter's boy saw them near the South Ridge 2 days ago. If they're raiding this close to town, we need to send a message." Miller responded, his face agitated as he gesticulated toward the mountains. "My cabin was cleaned out. Food, weapons, medicine, all taken. This isn't just about sending a message anymore. Those savages need to learn they can't steal from white men without consequences." The other men nodded in agreement, their expressions hardening with resolve. This was no random hunting party. This was a punitive expedition aimed directly at the Comanche camp, inspired at least in part by the very raid Rebecca had helped plan and execute. She had led these men directly toward the people who had saved her life. The realization struck her with physical force, driving the breath from her lungs as guilt clawed at her throat. She had believed the cabin would remain undiscovered until Spring had assured Nahko that the risk was minimal. Now, because of her miscalculation, the entire Comanche camp faced danger, not just from the 6 men currently around the fire, but from whatever larger force they might summon if they discovered the winter settlement. Nahko seemed to read her thoughts, his hand resting briefly on her shoulder in a gesture meant to calm rather than comfort. His expression remained focused, analytical, as he assessed the threat presented by the settler party. After observing for several more minutes, gathering what information they could about the settlers' weaponry, supplies, and apparent plans, Nahko signaled for them to withdraw. They retreated as carefully as they had approached, leaving no sign of their presence for the settlers to discover come morning. Once they had returned to their horses and moved a safe distance away, Nahko outlined his assessment of the situation. The settler party was following the same trail they had used returning from the Miller cabin, a trail that would eventually lead them to Eagle's Ridge, if they continued. However, they were moving slowly, hampered by their unfamiliarity with the terrain and their heavier equipment. Chaska would have reached the camp by now, warning Peter of the potential threat. The Comanche would already be preparing defensive measures, or more likely, making arrangements to move to a secondary location until the danger passed. Their own task now was to delay the settlers, to prevent them from discovering the camp's location until the Comanche had time to reach safety. Nahko proposed a plan that was both simple and audacious. They would create false trails leading away from Eagle's Ridge, then harass the settler party enough to force them to turn back without directly engaging in a conflict that might bring larger numbers of armed men into Comanche territory. As Rebecca absorbed the details of Nahko's plan, she found herself considering an alternative approach, one that utilized her unique position between 2 worlds. These were men who knew her, men who had condemned her to death and now threatened the people who had saved her. Perhaps there was a way to use that connection to the advantage of the Comanche. With measured gestures, she outlined her proposal. Instead of merely delaying the settlers, she would confront them directly, not as a Comanche ally, but as a ghost returned from the death they had intended for her. The sight of a woman they had left to die now appearing before them in the wilderness might be shocking enough to turn them back to Clearwater Valley. Maka and Takoda exchanged skeptical glances, clearly doubting the effectiveness of such a strategy. But Nahko studied her with thoughtful eyes, considering the psychological impact her appearance might have on men who believed they had condemned her to certain death. After a long moment, he nodded slowly. They would try Rebecca's approach first, with the warriors positioned nearby to intervene if the situation turned dangerous. If her appearance failed to deter the settlers, they would proceed with the original plan of false trails and harassment. As they prepared for morning, concealing themselves near the settlers' camp, where they could observe without being detected, Rebecca felt a curious calm settle over her. Tomorrow, she would face the men who had cast her out, not as a victim seeking revenge, but as someone who had found a strength they had never recognized, a resilience they had never anticipated, a community they had never valued. Whatever happened in that confrontation would mark the final severance of her ties to Clearwater Valley and the completion of her transformation from Rebecca Collins, the deaf settler's widow, to someone new, someone forged in silence and survival, someone who belonged neither fully to the world of settlers nor to the world of the Comanche, but to a space in between that was uniquely her own. Dawn arrived with reluctant fingers of light stretching across the snow-covered landscape. Rebecca had slept little, her mind occupied with preparations for the confrontation ahead. She sat cross-legged in their small, concealed camp, watching as Makia applied a mixture of earth and ash to her face, not in the distinctive patterns of Comanche warriors preparing for battle, but in a way that enhanced the gauntness of her features, deepening the hollows beneath her cheekbones and darkening the circles under her eyes. They cast out a woman Nako had signed the night before. Let them face what they created. In the dim light of early morning, Rebecca caught her reflection in a small piece of polished metal Takoda used as a signal mirror. The face that looked back at her was haunting. The face of someone who had walked through death and returned, weathered by elements and hardened by survival. Her hair, once neatly kept in settler fashion, now hung in two long braids, adorned with small wooden and bone beads given to her by Napua. Her skin, once sheltered from the sun, had darkened from months of outdoor life. Even her posture had changed. The timidity that had once characterized her movements, replaced by the balanced readiness she had learned from watching Comanche hunters. She was neither the woman Clearwater Valley had known, nor fully Comanche, but something else entirely, shaped by both worlds, yet belonging exclusively to neither. Nako approached, handing her a small pouch of dried herbs. The mixture, when chewed, would produce a slight numbing effect on her face, reducing the unconscious movements that might betray her emotions during the confrontation ahead. Rebecca accepted it with a nod, understanding that this was not merely about physical appearance but about presence, about presenting herself as something otherworldly, beyond the settlers' understanding. While the men of Clearwater Valley broke camp, packing their supplies with the inefficient bustling of those unaccustomed to life in the wild, the Comanche made their final preparations. Their plan was elegant in its simplicity. Rebecca would appear to the settlers alone, emerging from the forest at a point where the trail narrowed between two large rock formations. Nako, Maka, and Takoda would be positioned nearby, hidden but ready to intervene if necessary. The goal was not to provoke violence, but to create enough uncertainty and fear to turn the settlers back toward Clearwater Valley. If Rebecca's appearance failed to achieve this, the warriors would implement their original strategy of false trails and minor harassment. As the settlers mounted their horses and prepared to continue their journey, Nako touched Rebecca's shoulder briefly, a gesture of confidence, not concern. She met his gaze steadily, the herbs dulling the flutter of anxiety in her stomach. This was her choice, her opportunity to protect the people who had protected her, to repay a debt she had never expected to owe. The settlers proceeded slowly up the trail, their conversation muted by the cold morning air. Through gaps in the trees, Rebecca could see William Thornton leading the group, his straight-backed posture a reflection of his self-perceived authority. Edward Miller rode just behind him, his rifle resting across his saddle within easy reach. The other four men, Joseph Weber the blacksmith, his son Thomas, Dr. Samuel Porter, and Henry Davis the storekeeper, followed in a loose formation, their breath clouding around their heads in the frigid air. Rebecca moved silently through the forest, paralleling their path while staying concealed among the trees. She had spent months learning to move as the Comanche did, placing each foot deliberately, distributing her weight to minimize sound, using the terrain to mask her presence. Now, those lessons served her well as she navigated toward the chosen confrontation point ahead of the settler party. The narrow pass between the rock formations was still covered in untouched snow, glittering in the morning sunlight. Rebecca positioned herself at the far end, partially concealed by shadow, and waited. From her vantage point, she could see the settlers approaching, but remained unseen herself, a ghostly presence awaiting the perfect moment. As Thornton led his party into the narrow passage, Rebecca stepped forward, moving into full view at the exact point where the path widened again. Her timing was perfect. The men were committed to the passage with no room to turn their horses, forced to either proceed forward toward her or retreat backward in an awkward single file. The impact of her appearance was immediate and visceral. Joseph Weber, the first to spot her, pulled his horse up sharply with a violent jerk on the reins that caused the animal to rear slightly. His exclamation alerted the others, who turned, as one to stare at the figure blocking their path. For several heartbeats, silence held them all in its grip. Rebecca stood perfectly still, allowing them to absorb the reality of her presence. The woman they had condemned to death, standing before them transformed. William Thornton recovered first, his face contorting through confusion to disbelief, and finally settling into a mask of forced authority. His lips moved, forming words Rebecca couldn't hear, but could read clearly enough. "Colin's widow, how did you—" She cut him off with a raised hand, the gesture so commanding that he fell silent mid-sentence. Stepping forward with deliberate slowness, Rebecca positioned herself directly in the path of the horses, close enough that her features would be unmistakable to all present. When she finally spoke, she did so with the careful enunciation of the deaf, each word formed with precision, her voice likely sounding strange to their ears after months without regular speech. "You cast me out to die." The simple statement hung in the cold air between them. Dr. Porter crossed himself reflexively, while Thomas Weber's hand moved to the pistol at his belt, only to be stopped by his father's restraining grip. Edward Miller leaned forward in his saddle, his face flushing with anger that seemed to overwhelm his initial shock. "You should be dead," he said, the words clear on his lips. Rebecca smiled then, a cold expression that held no warmth or humor. "I should be," she agreed, watching their faces carefully for reactions. "You made certain of that, didn't you? All of you voted. All of you watched as I was dragged from my home. All of you turned away when I begged for mercy." She took another step forward, forcing Thornton's horse to back up slightly, its ears flattening against its head in nervous response to its rider's tension. "The wilderness should have killed you," Thornton said, his composure cracking slightly around the edges. "No woman alone could survive the winter, especially not—" He stopped himself, but Rebecca knew the unspoken word. Defective. It was how he had described her at the town meeting, her deafness rendering her less than whole in his estimation. "I did not survive alone," Rebecca replied, her voice carrying in the stillness of the pass. "I was found. I was taught. I was valued for what I could contribute." She gestured to the mountains around them, to the vast wilderness the settlers feared. "This land you call savage gave me what Clearwater Valley denied me, a place to belong." Dr. Porter shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. Unlike the others, he had at least attempted to argue against her expulsion, suggesting alternatives, before ultimately surrendering to Thornton's influence. Now, his medical training seemed to be warring with the superstition that flickered across his features. "Rebecca," he said, using her name while the others had pointedly avoided doing so, "you should come back with us." Whatever has happened to you, whatever arrangement you've made to survive, you're still one of us. You belong in civilization, not civilization. Rebecca interrupted, the word sharp on her tongue. Is that what you call a community that discards people when they become inconvenient? That values profit over compassion? That fears difference so much it would rather cast it out than understand it? She turned her attention back to Thornton, whose face had hardened into the rigid mask of authority she remembered from the town meeting. You're trespassing, she told him. This territory belongs to the Comanche now. We're pursuing thieves, Miller interjected, his anger apparently overcoming his unease. Indians raided my hunting cabin, stole weapons, supplies. We have every right to... You have no rights here. Rebecca cut him off, her voice level but firm. The Comanche know you're coming. They've moved their camp, hidden their trails. If you continue, you'll find nothing but empty forest and your own frozen bodies when the next storm comes. It was a calculated statement, designed to plant doubt without revealing that the camp had not yet been evacuated. The mention of an approaching storm was a gamble, but February in the mountains made it a reasonable one. You're lying, Thornton said, but uncertainty had crept into his expression. You're trying to protect them. Why? What have they done to you? Brainwashed you? Threatened you? Rebecca laughed then, a sound she couldn't hear but could feel vibrating in her chest. The notion that she would need to be coerced into opposing Clearwater Valley struck her as genuinely amusing. They saved me, she said simply. When you left me to die, they gave me life. When you mocked my silence, they taught me to speak with my hands. When you saw only what I lacked, they recognized what I could offer. She took another step forward, close enough now that she could see the individual whiskers in Thornton's neatly trimmed beard, could read the fear beneath his anger. Go back to Clearwater Valley, she told him, infusing her voice with all the authority she had observed in Peter addressing the Comanche Council. Tell them the mountains are closed to you. Tell them the woman you condemned has found justice elsewhere. For a long moment, the tableau held, Rebecca standing unmoving before 6 mounted men, her presence alone creating an impassable barrier. Then Thomas Weber, the youngest of the group, broke the silence with words that sent a ripple of visible tension through the others. She's not alone, he said, pointing toward the rocks above the pass. Look there and there. Rebecca didn't need to look to know what he had spotted. Nako, Takoda, and Maka had revealed themselves strategically, positioned at various points overlooking the narrow trail. Each held a bow, drawn and ready, arrows aimed directly at the settler party. It was not part of the original plan, a contingency implemented because the standoff had continued longer than anticipated. The message was clear. The settlers could retreat peacefully, or they could die where they stood. Thornton's face contorted with rage and fear, his hand moving toward his rifle before common sense prevailed. They were outmatched in position, if not in numbers, caught in a natural trap with limited maneuverability. This isn't over, he said, the words clipped and bitter. You've made your choice, Mrs. Collins. Don't expect mercy when we return in greater numbers. Rebecca maintained her steady gaze. There is no Mrs. Collins anymore. She died the night you cast her out. She gestured toward the way they had come. Go now, while you still can. For another tense moment, it seemed Thornton might resist out of sheer stubbornness. Then Dr. Porter spoke up, his voice carrying an edge of desperate reason. William, we should turn back. We're not prepared for this. We can return with more men, better supplies. The implicit admission of defeat clearly grated on Thornton, but self-preservation eventually won out. With a curt gesture, he signaled for the party to turn around. The maneuver was awkward in the confined space, horses jostling against each other as their riders struggled to reorient them. As they retreated, Edward Miller twisted in his saddle to deliver a final threat. "We know your face now," he called back. "You can't hide among savages forever." Rebecca watched them go, maintaining her position until they had disappeared around a bend in the trail. Only then did she allow her shoulders to relax, the tension draining from her body as she exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Nako appeared beside her, moving with the silent efficiency that still sometimes startled her, despite months in Comanche company. His expression was measured as he studied her face, looking for signs of distress or regret. Rebecca shook her head slightly, answering his unasked question. She felt neither. What she experienced instead was a curious sense of completion, as if a circle had been closed, a chapter ended. She had faced the men who had condemned her and found them smaller than she remembered. Their power over her diminished to nothing by her own transformation. While Takoda tracked the retreating settlers to ensure they continued toward Clearwater Valley, Nako and Maka conferred briefly about their next steps. The encounter had gone better than anticipated. The settlers turned back with no bloodshed. But the threat remained. Thornton would not accept defeat so easily, and his parting words suggested he would indeed return with a larger force once he had regrouped. The Comanche camp needed to be relocated immediately. The supplies they had acquired from the Miller cabin would have to be packed and transported. The elderly and children prepared for travel, temporary shelters established in the secondary location until they determined whether it was safe to return to Eagle's Ridge. As they mounted their horses to return to the camp and deliver this news, Rebecca found herself wondering about the long-term implications of her choice. She had severed her final ties to Clearwater Valley, positioned herself unequivocally as an ally of the Comanche against her former community. There could be no going back now, no possibility of reconciliation or reintegration. Yet the finality of this realization brought no regret, only a sense of rightness, as if she had finally stepped fully into the person she was meant to become. The path ahead might be uncertain, but it was undeniably hers to choose. The camp was already in motion when they arrived, Chaska's warning having spurred immediate preparations for departure. Teepees were being dismantled, supplies packed onto travois. Children gathered into groups for easier supervision during the journey. Peter stood at the center of this organized chaos, directing activities with the calm efficiency of a leader accustomed to crisis. He greeted their return with a raised hand, his weathered face showing relief at finding them all unharmed. As Nahko reported on the confrontation with the settlers, Peter's gaze shifted to Rebecca, studying her with newfound consideration. When Nahko finished his account, Peter approached her directly, something he had rarely done in the months she had lived. Among the Comanche, using the sign language she had mastered, he asked a simple question. "Are you satisfied with what you have done?" The question caught Rebecca by surprise. She had expected inquiries about the settlers' numbers or plans, about the likelihood of their return, or the wisdom of confronting them directly. Instead, Peter seemed concerned with her emotional state, with whether her actions had brought her the resolution she sought. After a moment's reflection, she nodded. "They needed to see that they failed," she signed in response. "That what they intended as my ending became a beginning instead." Peter's expression remained solemn, but there was approval in the slight inclination of his head. "Endings and beginnings are often the same moment viewed from different directions," he signed, the philosophical nature of the statement reminding Rebecca that he was not merely a war chief, but a spiritual leader for his people. He gestured toward the bustling activity of the camp. "We leave this place because of your warning, not despite your actions. You have protected the people who protected you. This completes a circle." The significance of his words wasn't lost on Rebecca. In Comanche culture, such reciprocity was highly valued, the fulfillment of obligations, the maintenance of balance. By helping to turn away the settler party, she had repaid the debt she owed for her rescue and acceptance into the tribe. "What happens now?" she asked, the question encompassing far more than just their immediate plans for relocation. Peter considered her for a moment before responding. "Now you choose again," he signed. "Each day is a new choice. Yesterday you were a woman between worlds. Today you stood against those who cast you out. Tomorrow." He left the statement unfinished, a question for her to answer. Before Rebecca could respond, Napua appeared at her side, the girl's face etched with concern, despite her efforts to maintain the stoic demeanor expected of Comanche youth. Without preamble, she took Rebecca's hand and led her toward the area, where Makia was supervising the packing of medicinal supplies. The elderly healer looked up as they approached, her gnarled hands pausing in their careful wrapping of dried herbs. Her sharp eyes took in Rebecca's appearance, the earth and ash still smudged on her face, the intensity of her expression, and seemed to understand immediately what had occurred. She gestured for Rebecca to sit beside her, then resumed her packing while addressing Napua. "Bring water," she signed, "clean cloth." When Napua had departed on this errand, Makia turned her full attention to Rebecca. "You faced them," she stated rather than asked, her hands moving with the efficient precision that characterized all her actions. Rebecca nodded, suddenly aware of the emotional weight of the confrontation now that the immediate tension had passed. Her hands trembled slightly as she described the encounter, the shock on the settlers' faces, Thornton's anger, Miller's threats. Makia listened without interruption, her weathered face impassive. When Rebecca finished, the older woman was silent for a long moment, her fingers absently tracing the pattern on a medicine pouch. "When I was young," she finally signed, "my husband was killed by settlers. They came to trade, then returned with guns when they found gold in our territory. I wanted to hate all white faces after that, to see them all as enemies." She paused as Napua returned with a bowl of clean snowmelt and strips of cloth. Taking one of the cloths, she dipped it in the water and began to gently remove the earth and ash from Rebecca's face. The gesture was unexpectedly tender, like a mother caring for a child. "But hate is a poor guide," Makia continued, her signs flowing between movements as she cleaned Rebecca's face. "It narrows the path before you until only one direction remains. The Comanche way is to see all paths, to choose with clear eyes." Rebecca remained still under Makia's ministrations, absorbing the wisdom in her words. "I don't hate them," she signed when the older woman had finished. "Not anymore. I pity them for their fear, for the smallness of their vision." A rare smile ghosted across Makia's lips. "That is a stronger position than hatred," she acknowledged. "But be cautious. Pity can become pride if not balanced with humility." The conversation was interrupted by a call from Peter, gathering the tribe for final instructions before departure. The relocation would need to be accomplished quickly, with the entire camp moved to the secondary location before nightfall. The journey would be challenging, particularly for the very young and the elderly, but necessary given the threat of settler retaliation. As Rebecca moved to join the gathering, she felt a hand on her shoulder. Turning, she found Nako standing, behind her, his expression thoughtful. He had removed his war paint and changed into traveling clothes, but the intensity of his gaze remained unchanged from their confrontation with the settlers. "You took a risk," he signed, his movements conveying both statement and question. Rebecca nodded. "It was mine to take." "Why?" he asked, the directness typical of Comanche communication. The question gave her pause. Why had she chosen to confront Thornton and the others so directly? Was it vengeance, justice, or something else? "Entirely. To become real again," she finally replied, the signs forming slowly as she articulated a truth she hadn't fully recognized until that moment. "When they cast me out, they tried to erase me. to pretend I had never existed once I was gone from sight. By standing before them, I refused to be erased. Nako's eyes held hers for a long moment, something shifting in their depths. "The Comanche have a saying," he signed. "A person exists 3 times, in body, in memory, and in spirit. Your body they tried to destroy, your memory they tried to forget, but your spirit..." His hands completed the thought. "Your spirit they could never touch." The insight resonated deeply with Rebecca, crystallizing something she had felt but not articulated during her confrontation with the settlers. They had attempted to control her existence on every level, yet had ultimately failed because they could not reach the essential core of who she was, the spirit that had survived, adapted, and grown stronger in the silence. They feared. The camp moved with remarkable efficiency, years of practice evident in the way each person fulfilled their role without need for constant direction. Children helped with smaller tasks, elders supervised from travois pulled by sturdy ponies. Warriors ranged ahead and behind to guard against potential threats. By midday, no trace remained of their presence at Eagle's Ridge, save for the compressed snow where teepees had stood. Rebecca traveled near the center of the group, assisting Makia with the transport of medicinal supplies. The journey to the secondary location, a sheltered valley deeper in the mountains, known to the Comanche but rarely visited by settlers, would take most of the day, following paths visible only to those familiar with the terrain. As they crossed, a ridge offering a panoramic view of the territory below, Rebecca paused momentarily, orienting herself relative to Clearwater Valley. Somewhere beyond those distant hills lay the settlement that had once been her home, the people who had once been her community. The distance seemed both vast and insignificant, a physical separation that mattered less than the internal journey she had undergone. Nako, riding nearby, noticed her pause and guided his horse alongside hers. Following her gaze toward the distant horizon, he seemed to understand her thoughts without need for explanation. "They will come looking again," he signed, his expression somber. Rebecca nodded. Thornton was not a man to accept defeat, particularly at the hands of a woman he had deemed worthless and savages he considered beneath contempt. His pride would demand a response, and that response would likely come with greater force once the initial shock of their encounter had faded. "What will happen when they do?" she asked. Nako considered the question carefully, his gaze still fixed on the distant landscape. "That depends on many things," he finally responded. "On how many come, on whether they seek only revenge or something more, on what other threats emerge before then." He turned to face her directly, ensuring she could read his next signs clearly, "and on what role you choose to play when that time comes." The statement was neither a question nor a directive, simply an acknowledgement that her position remained unique, her path still unfolding. She had rejected Clearwater Valley and been accepted by the Comanche, but the space she occupied between these worlds continued to evolve with each choice she made. As they descended from the ridge, rejoining the main body of the tribe, Rebecca found herself considering Nako's words. The coming conflict between settlers and Comanche seemed inevitable, the product of colliding worldviews, competing claims to the same territory, mutual incomprehension exacerbated by fear and prejudice. Yet within that larger struggle, her personal journey continued. She had survived abandonment, learned to thrive in her silence, confronted those who had condemned her, and protected those who had saved her. Each step had transformed her, creating something new from the ashes of what had been destroyed. The woman who had once been Rebecca Collins, dependent on others to interpret the world for her, now moved with confidence through a landscape many would find terrifying. The deaf widow, who had been deemed helpless, now taught Comanche children to read vibrations through earth and water, to identify plants by their texture and smell, to move silently through forest and field. Whatever came next, whether confrontation with Clearwater Valley or continued life among the Comanche or some as yet unimagined path, she would face it not as a victim of circumstance, but as the architect of her own destiny. The silence that had once isolated her had become a space of power and possibility, a language all its own that she had learned to speak fluently. By late afternoon, the tribe arrived at the secondary location, a valley sheltered by steep cliff. Faces on three sides, accessible only through a narrow pass that could be easily defended if necessary. A small stream, partially frozen but still flowing beneath the ice, provided water. The surrounding forest offered both firewood and concealment. Camp was established with the same efficiency that had characterized the departure from Eagle's Ridge. By sunset, teepees stood in the traditional circular arrangement. Cook fires burned and sentries had been posted at strategic locations overlooking the single approach. That evening, as the tribe gathered for the communal meal, Peter made an unexpected announcement. Standing at the center of the circle, illuminated by the central fire, he called for attention and began to speak and sign simultaneously, an accommodation that had become increasingly common in respect of Rebecca's presence. "Today, we leave. On home for another," he began, his gestures deliberate and clear. "We do this not in fear, but in wisdom. The path of the Comanche has always been to move with the seasons, to follow the buffalo, to go where the land provides." He paused, his gaze traveling around the circle, acknowledging each family group, each individual. "But we also move to protect what matters most. Not our possessions, not even our territory, but our people. All our people." At this, his eyes came to rest on Rebecca, seated between Makia and Napua at the edge of the circle. A murmur went through the assembled tribe as they followed his gaze, understanding the significance of his words. "When many hands found this woman in the snow," Peter continued, using Nako's Comanche name, "some questioned his judgment in bringing her to our fire. When I allowed her to remain, some questioned my wisdom." He paused again, allowing the words to settle. Rebecca felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon her, but straightened her spine, meeting their gaze without flinching. "Today she stood against her own kind to protect ours," Peter stated, his signs emphatic. "She warned us of danger and risk to herself. She chose a side when she could have remained silent." With a gesture toward Makia, he called the elderly healer forward. She rose slowly, her age evident in the stiffness of her movements, and approached the center of the circle. From a pouch at her waist, she withdrew something small that caught the firelight, a medallion of some kind hanging from a leather cord. Peter accepted it from her with reverence, holding it up for all to see. The medallion, Rebecca realized, was crafted from a pale material, bone or antler, carved with intricate symbols she didn't recognize. "This belonged to my grandmother's grandmother," Peter explained. "It has been passed to those who bridge worlds, healers who walk between life and death, scouts who move between our territory and our enemies, children born of two tribes who bring strength from both." He gestured for Rebecca to approach. For a moment she hesitated, uncertain of the protocol, until Napua gave her a gentle nudge forward. Rising to her feet, Rebecca moved to stand before Peter, intensely aware of the ceremonial nature of the moment, though she didn't fully understand its significance. "You are not Comanche by birth," Peter signed for her benefit while speaking aloud for the others. "You will never be Comanche in the way of those born to our fire, but you have earned a place among us, not as a guest, not as a captive, but as one who bridges worlds." He placed the medallion around her neck, its weight slight but immediately noticeable against her skin. "With this, the tribe acknowledges your choice and your contribution. You are Kimi, Secret One, who walks in silence but speaks through actions." The name settled over Rebecca like a mantle, not replacing who she had been, but adding a new dimension to who she was becoming. Kimmy, Secret 1. It captured something essential about her nature, about the quiet strength she had developed in her silent world. As Peter stepped back, something unexpected happened. Makia began to tap a rhythm against a small hand drum, the vibrations carrying through the ground to Rebecca's feet. One by one, others joined in, some with drums, some by striking sticks against logs, some by stamping their feet in unison. Though Rebecca couldn't hear the sound, she could feel it, a pulsing rhythm that seemed to synchronize with her heartbeat, a tangible expression of acceptance and incorporation. This was no passive tolerance of her difference. It was an active embrace of it, a recognition that her silence was not an absence, but a different form of presence. For the first time since Daniel's death, Rebecca felt tears spring to her eyes, not from grief or fear or loss, but from the overwhelming sensation of belonging. She had found her place, not despite her deafness, but in some ways because of it, the very quality that Clearwater Valley had deemed her greatest weakness, becoming a source of strength and connection in this new context. As the vibrations continued around her, Rebecca raised her hands and began to sign, not practical communications about hunting or weather or supplies, but the poetry Daniel had taught her in the early days of their marriage. Signs for sky and earth, for journey and return, for death and rebirth flowed from her fingers, translating into movement the emotions too complex for spoken language. Some among the Comanche recognized individual signs, nodding in understanding. Others simply watched, appreciating the grace of the movements without needing to comprehend their specific meaning. It was communication on multiple levels simultaneously. An integration of her past and present, her settler education, and her Comanche adaptation. When she finished, the vibrations gradually subsided, replaced by a stillness that felt like completion rather than absence. Peter nodded once, acknowledging the significance of what had transpired, then gestured for the meal to begin. As the formality of the moment dissolved into the practical business of distributing food, Rebecca returned to her place beside Makia and Napua. The girl reached out hesitantly to touch the medallion at Rebecca's throat, her young face solemn with recognition of its importance. "It means you stay," Napua signed, the simple statement carrying layers of meaning beyond its basic interpretation. "It means you belong." Belong. Such a small word for such an enormous concept. Rebecca closed her fingers around the medallion, feeling its intricate carvings against her skin. She had belonged to Clearwater Valley once, or thought she had. She had belonged to Daniel, finding in his love a sanctuary from a world that often excluded her. Now she belonged to this community, not through birth or marriage, but through choice and action. Yet beneath all these external belongings lay something more fundamental, a belonging to herself that had emerged through the crucible of abandonment and survival. That, perhaps, was the most significant transformation of all. As night settled over the valley and the tribe prepared for sleep, Rebecca stood at the entrance to her newly erected teepee, gazing at the stars scattered across the dark expanse above. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, continued preparations for potential conflict with Clearwater Valley, adaptation to their temporary home, the ongoing work of survival in the harsh mountain winter. But tonight, for this moment, there was a stillness within her that matched the silence of her world. Not empty, but filled with possibility, with connection, with the quiet certainty of having found her place in a story much larger than herself. Kimmy, Secret 1, a name that acknowledged both her difference and her value, a recognition that some truths are best expressed not through sound, but through presence. She touched the medallion once more, its weight already becoming familiar against her skin, then turned to enter her teepee. Whatever came next, be it conflict or peace, hardship or prosperity, she would face it not as Rebecca Collins, the abandoned deaf widow, nor as a nameless outcast, but as Kimmy of the Comanche, one who walked between worlds, bringing strength from both, one who had transformed silence from curse to blessing, one who had found, in the language of hands and heart, a voice that needed no sound to be heard. Spring arrived with tentative warmth, melting the snow in patches and turning the forest floor into a tapestry of brown and green. 3 months had passed since the confrontation with William Thornton and his men. 3 months of watchfulness, of preparation, of waiting for a retaliation that had not yet materialized. The Comanche had remained at their secondary location. Long after they would normally have begun their spring migration, the unusual settlement pattern a precaution against the threatened settler incursion. Kimmy, for she now thought of herself by her Comanche name more often than as Rebecca, stood at the edge of the valley, breathing in the scent of renewal that permeated the air. New growth sprouted from seemingly dead branches, crocus and snowdrop, pushed through the remaining patches of snow, and birdsong filled the trees that had stood silent through the long winter months. Though she couldn't hear the birds, she had learned to feel their presence through the subtle vibrations they created in branches, through the movement of air displaced by their wings, through the visual poetry of their flight patterns. Her world had expanded in ways she never could have imagined during her life in Clearwater Valley, her senses attuned to nuances that hearing people often missed entirely. Nearby, Napua practiced with a small bow, her young face serious with concentration as she aimed at a target fashioned from bundled grass. The girl had become a constant companion over the winter months, her initial wariness transforming into a relationship that resembled sisterhood. She had taken it upon herself to ensure Kimmy learned Comanche ways properly, correcting her technique in crafting, cooking, and hunting with the blunt honesty of youth. In return, Kimmy had taught Napua to read and write English, skills the girl had initially dismissed as useless, but gradually came to value as she recognized their potential for understanding the settler world. Together, they had created a small dictionary of shared signs, building a bridge between Comanche hand talk and the formal sign language Kimmy had learned from Daniel. A movement at the edge of her vision drew Kimmy's attention. Nahko approached. From the direction of the forest, his expression more serious than usual. He had been leading a scouting party for the past 3 days, assessing the situation around Clearwater Valley before the tribe made decisions about their spring migration. Kimmy straightened, alert to the tension in his posture. Something had changed. Napua noticed as well, lowering her bow and watching intently as Nahko reached them. "The settlers are coming," he signed without preamble, his movements sharp with urgency. Not just Thornton and his men, many more. A cold weight settled in Kimmy's stomach. How many? How soon? 20, perhaps more, armed with rifles, pistols. They bring wagons, not for trading, for carrying supplies. They follow our winter trails, 3 days away, perhaps 4. 20 armed men represented a significant threat, far more than the Comanche warriors could directly confront with any hope of success. The wagons suggested an extended expedition, not a brief, punitive raid. This was a deliberate, organized effort to find and eliminate what they perceived as a threat to their expansion. "Peta has called council," Nahko continued, gesturing toward the center of the camp where people were already gathering. "We must decide quickly." As they walked toward the council, Kimmy's mind raced through possibilities. The confrontation she had hoped to avoid by turning back Thornton's smaller party now seemed inevitable, merely delayed rather than prevented. But circumstances had changed in those intervening months. The tribe was stronger now, the worst of winter behind them, their supplies replenished through careful hunting and foraging. They had options beyond mere survival. The council circle had already formed when they arrived. faces grave as Takoda provided details of what the scouting party had observed. The settler expedition was well equipped, determined, and followed a methodical search pattern that suggested they would eventually discover the secondary camp location if the Comanche remained. Peter listened in silence, his weathered face unreadable, as he absorbed the information. When Takoda finished, the elderly leader looked around the circle, his gaze lingering briefly on each face as if committing them to memory. "We have three choices," he signed and spoke simultaneously, the practice now firmly established in tribal discussions. "We can fight, ambush them in the narrow passes where their numbers matter less. We can flee, begin our spring migration early, move beyond their reach. Or we can divide, warriors to delay them, others to travel ahead and prepare." Each option carried significant risks. Direct confrontation might result in severe casualties on both sides, potentially bringing even larger forces from the settlements. In retaliation, fleeing meant abandoning traditional hunting grounds and protective territory. Dividing the tribe created vulnerability for both groups. Various members of the council spoke, offering perspectives and preferences. Quinai, predictably, advocated for confrontation, arguing that retreat would only embolden the settlers to push farther into Comanche territory. Makia cautioned against dividing their strength when facing a determined enemy. Others raised concerns about the practicalities of rapid migration with children and elders. Throughout the discussion, Kimmy remained silent, listening with her eyes as she had learned to do long before joining the Comanche. The medallion Peter had given her months, earlier rested against her skin beneath her deerskin tunic, a constant reminder of her unique position between worlds. Finally, Peter turned to her directly. "Kimmy!" he signed, the name flowing naturally from his fingers. "You know these men. You know their minds. What do they truly seek?" All eyes turned to her, waiting. The question cut to the heart of the situation. This wasn't merely about a raid on a hunting cabin or an isolated confrontation in the mountains. This expedition represented something larger, a collision between expanding settlement and indigenous resistance, between incompatible ways of living on the same land. "They seek certainty," she signed after a moment's reflection. "When I confronted them, I created doubt. I showed them that what they believed impossible, my survival, my choice to stand with the Comanche, was real. That frightens them more than any raid or attack." She paused, considering her next words carefully. "They come not just for revenge or to recover stolen goods. They come to restore their belief that they are right to take this land, right to determine who belongs and who doesn't, right to decide who lives and who dies." The council absorbed this assessment in silence. Then Nako spoke, his signs directed primarily to Peter, but visible to all. "If what they seek is certainty, then we must give them uncertainty instead. Not through direct battle, but through confusion, making them question what they see, what they know, what they believe." Kimmy felt something shift within her as Nako's suggestion took shape. An idea began to form, one that drew on everything she had learned during her months with the Comanche, on her understanding of the settler mindset, on the unique perspective her deafness had given her. "I can help create that uncertainty," she signed, her movements gathering confidence as the concept solidified. "Not through violence, but through presence, through story." She outlined her proposal, bold, unconventional, but aligned with Comanche tactics that valued misdirection and psychological advantage over direct confrontation when facing superior numbers. It would require perfect timing, absolute trust, and a willingness to take significant personal risk. When she finished, silence held the council in its grip. Some faces reflected skepticism, others thoughtful consideration. Peter studied her with eyes that seemed to see beyond her physical presence to the core of her motivation. "You would risk yourself for this?" he asked finally. Kimmy nodded without hesitation. This conflict began with me. Perhaps it can end with me as well. After further discussion, the council reached a decision. They would implement Kimmy's plan with certain modifications suggested by Nako and Takoda. The tribe would divide temporarily, with most members beginning the spring migration, while a small group of warriors remained behind to execute the strategy. As the council dispersed to begin preparations, Kimmy felt the weight of responsibility settle across her shoulders. The plan was hers, and if it failed, the consequences would fall heavily on those who had become her family. Nako approached her as she stood lost in thought. "Are you certain of this path?" he signed, his expression concerned rather than doubtful. Kimmy met his gaze steadily. "I am certain only that it offers a better chance than direct conflict." He studied her face for a long moment before nodding acceptance. "Then we begin now." The next 3 days passed in a flurry of activity. The main body of the tribe departed, taking the elderly, children, and most of their possessions toward summer hunting grounds to the west. Those who remained, 12 warriors including Nako and Takoda, Makia, who refused to leave her patients, and Kimmy herself, prepared meticulously for what was to come. The confrontation, when it finally arrived, unfolded in ways none of them could have fully anticipated. The settler party entered the valley shortly after dawn on the 4th day, their approach marked by the distinctive sounds of horses and wagons that Kimmy could feel through the ground, if not hear. She waited at the center of the abandoned camp, seated cross-legged before the cold ashes of the council fire. Wearing the ceremonial dress Makia had helped her prepare for this moment. Around her neck hung the medallion Peter had given her, now joined by other symbols of her dual identity. A small cross that had been Daniel's, feathers and beads woven into her braids in Comanche fashion, moccasins decorated with the spiral a pattern Nepua had created to represent visible sound. She remained perfectly still as the first riders appeared between the trees, watching without reaction as they spotted her and called back to those behind them. William Thornton rode at the head of the group, flanked by Edward Miller and several men she recognized from Clearwater Valley. Behind them came strangers, likely from neighboring settlements, drawn by promises of Comanche treasures or simply by the opportunity for violence sanctioned as justice. Thornton reined his horse to a halt several yards away, his expression shifting from triumph to wariness as he took in the empty camp and the solitary figure at its center. This was not the scene he had expected, not a village to raid or warriors to fight, but a single woman waiting with unnatural stillness. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Thornton dismounted, approaching cautiously with his rifle held ready. Others followed, spreading out in a semicircle that allowed them to watch both Kimmy and the surrounding forest for signs of ambush. "Where are they?" Thornton demanded when he stood before her, his voice visible in the movement of his lips, but carrying an uncertainty that betrayed his discomfort. Kimmy remained seated, her posture relaxed, despite the weapons pointed in her direction. When she finally spoke, she did so in both English and signs simultaneously, her voice carrying the distinctive cadence of one who cannot hear themselves speak. "They are gone," she said simply. "They have been gone for many days." Confusion rippled through the assembled men. Miller stepped forward, his face twisted with anger and frustration. "You're lying. The tracks are fresh. We followed them here." A subtle smile curved Kimmy's lips. "Yes," she agreed. "You followed the tracks we wanted you to follow." The admission heightened their unease. Several men glanced nervously at the surrounding forest, raising their rifles in anticipation of imminent attack. But the trees remained still, the valley silent save for the natural sounds of spring. "This is a trap," someone said, voice rising with panic. "They're waiting to ambush us." Thornton silenced him with a sharp gesture, his attention fixed on Kimmy. Where is our stolen property, the weapons, supplies taken from Miller's cabin? Stolen? Kimmy echoed, genuine amusement in her expression. Like this land was stolen, like my home was stolen when you burned it after casting me out to die. The direct challenge visibly unsettled Thornton. He had expected to confront savages, to enact righteous retribution against thieves and murderers. Instead, he faced the living embodiment of his own cruelty, speaking truths he had worked hard to justify or forget. "You made your choice," he said, falling back on the rationalization that had allowed Clearwater Valley to abandon her. "You chose to side with Indians against your own kind." "My own kind," Kimmy repeated, rising smoothly to her feet. Several rifles tracked her movement, but she showed no concern. "My kind are those who value me for what I can contribute, not for what I cannot hear. My kind recognized my worth when you saw only burden." She approached Thornton with measured steps, stopping just beyond arm's reach. "You came seeking certainty, proof that your actions were justified, that your beliefs about the Comanche, about me, were correct. But I offer you only questions instead." With deliberate movements, she gestured toward the surrounding valley. As if on cue, 12 Comanche warriors emerged silently from different points around the perimeter. Not charging, not attacking, simply revealing their presence in locations that should have been impossible to reach undetected. The settlers reacted with predictable alarm, guns swinging wildly as they tried to cover too many directions at once. But the warriors made no aggressive moves, standing just beyond effective rifle range, watching with impassive expressions. "You are surrounded," Kimmy stated calmly. "You have been since you entered the valley. You sit in the palm of Comanche patience, alive only because they choose not to close their fingers." It was true, though not in the way the settlers might interpret it. The 12 warriors visible around the valley were all that remained. There was no larger force hidden nearby, no reinforcements waiting to attack, but the psychological impact of their silent appearance, of the knowledge that they had been observed without realizing it, created precisely the uncertainty Kimmy had intended. Thornton struggled to maintain his composure, to assert control over a situation rapidly slipping from his grasp. "We didn't come to negotiate with savages," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "We came for justice." "Justice," Kimmy repeated, the word weighted with irony. "Let me tell you what justice would look like, William Thornton." She stepped back, creating space between them, and began to sign as she spoke, not for the benefit of the Comanche, who could see her from their positions, but to emphasize her dual identity, her belonging to both worlds and neither. "Justice would be watching you experience what you inflicted on me, abandonment in winter, without shelter or supplies. Justice would be the Comanche treating you as you treated them, as less than human, as obstacles to be removed from land you covet. Justice would be your certainty shattered, your security destroyed, your community divided against itself." She paused, allowing her words to sink in. Some of the men shifted uncomfortably, their earlier bloodlust tempered by the realization of their vulnerability. Others maintained their hostile stance, too committed to their purpose to consider alternatives. "But justice is not what I offer you today," Kimmy continued. "Instead, I offer you a choice, the same choice you denied me. Return to Clearwater Valley. Tell them the Comanche have moved on, following the buffalo herds west. Tell them this territory is empty, undesirable, not worth the blood it would cost to claim it." Thornton's expression hardened. "And if we refuse this generous offer, if we decide to finish what we came to do?" Kimmy met his gaze without flinching. "Then you will learn That certainty is the first casualty of war. A tense silence followed, the moment balanced on a knife's edge between violence and resolution. Kimmy could see the calculations running behind Thornton's eyes, the weighing of pride against practicality, of vengeance against survival. Finally, Edward Miller broke the impasse. "This is madness, William," he said, his voice carrying clearly despite his attempt to speak privately. "We're exposed here. We don't know how many more are hiding in these mountains. The hunting cabin can be restocked. The territory isn't worth dying for." Others murmured agreement, the earlier confidence of their expedition eroded by the unexpected situation they now faced. What had seemed a straightforward punitive mission against primitive savages had transformed into something more complex and unsettling. Thornton stood rigid with frustrated rage, unwilling to retreat, yet increasingly aware that his options were limited. His authority, derived primarily from the community's perception of his judgment, would not survive leading them into a massacre. "This isn't over," he said finally, the words directed at Kimmy, but loud enough for all to hear. "These lands will be settled. Your friends are just delaying the inevitable." Kimmy nodded, acknowledging the truth in his statement without conceding its righteousness. "Perhaps," she replied, "but today you choose life over pride. Tomorrow belongs to tomorrow." The settlers' departure was not the chaotic retreat Kimmy had half expected, but a measured withdrawal, dignity preserved through the pretense that they were choosing to leave rather than being forced to do so. Thornton maintained his rigid posture as he led his men from the valley, refusing to look back at the woman who had orchestrated his defeat. Only when the last rider had disappeared from view did the tension release from Kimmy's body. Her shoulders, dropping slightly as she exhaled a breath held too long. Nako approached from his position at the edge of the clearing, his expression a mixture of relief and admiration. "They may return with more men," he signed, practical even in victory. "They may," Kimmy agreed, "but not today, not tomorrow. And when they do, they will carry the seed of doubt we planted. They will remember that their certainty was proven false once before." Together, they watched as the other warriors emerged, fully from their concealment, gathering at the center of the abandoned camp. There was no celebration, no exultation in their success, only the quiet satisfaction of having protected their people without bloodshed. Makia joined them, her weathered face solemn, as she placed a hand on Kimmy's shoulder. "You have completed another circle," she signed. "The woman they cast out has sent them away in turn." The observation carried no judgment, merely recognition of balance restored. Yet Kimmy felt no triumph in the symmetry, no vindication in turning Thornton away as he had once turned her away. What she experienced instead was a profound sense of closure, a chapter ending, a wound finally healing clean. "What now?" Dakota asked the question directed to all of them, but his gaze resting on Kimmy. It was Nako who answered, his signs carrying the authority of one who had earned respect through wisdom rather than force. "Now we follow our people west. The summer hunt awaits." He looked at Kimmy, a question in his eyes that he did not sign aloud. "And you?" For a moment, Kimmy stood balanced between possibilities. She could return to Clearwater Valley, reclaim her property now that she had proven her ability to survive. She could travel to other settlements, perhaps find a community more accepting of her differences. She could forge an entirely new path, separate from both settler and Comanche life. But as she felt the weight of the medallion against her skin, as she recognized the faces around her not as strangers or savages, but as family chosen rather than born to, she knew her decision had been made long ago. Perhaps in the moment, Nako had first extended his hand to her in the forest. Perhaps during the long winter months of learning and adaptation, perhaps in the council circle when Peter had named her Kimi. "I go with you," she signed. The movement simple but the commitment profound. My path lies with the Comanche now. The journey west began at dawn the following day. 12 warriors, 1 healer, and a woman who walked between worlds departed. The valley that had sheltered them through winter's end, following trails known only to those who had inhabited this land for generations. They would rejoin the main body of the tribe within a week, resuming the cycle of seasonal migration that had sustained the Comanche for centuries. As they crested the final ridge overlooking the valley, Kimmy paused to look back. From this vantage point she could see far into the distance, the mountains where Eagle's Ridge lay, the forests surrounding Clearwater Valley, the territories where settler and indigenous lives intersected with increasing frequency and tension. The conflict was not over, would not be over within her lifetime. The settlers would continue to push west, driven by the same conviction that had led William Thornton to cast her out and later to pursue the Comanche with armed men. The indigenous peoples would continue to resist, adapting their strategies as circumstances changed, fighting to maintain their way of life against seemingly inexorable pressure. But Kimmy's personal battle had reached its resolution. She had confronted those who had condemned her and found them diminished in her eyes. She had faced the wilderness they had expected to kill her and discovered in it not death, but rebirth. She had transformed her greatest perceived weakness into a unique strength, her silence becoming a space of power rather than limitation. Nako waited a few paces ahead, patient as she completed her farewell to a landscape that had witnessed her transformation. When she turned to join him, her movements carried the fluid grace of one who had learned to navigate the world through observation rather than sound. "Ready?" he signed, the question encompassing far more than their immediate journey. Kimmy nodded, fingers forming a response that needed no voice to be understood. "I am Kimmy now, Secret One. I walk in silence, but my path is clear." Together, they descended the western slope, following the Comanche way toward horizons new yet familiar, into a future uncertain, but faced with open eyes and steady hands. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.